The moment is at hand. A company that's certainly quite daunting to cover. They're right up there in terms of size with others I've done, that's for sure. And in terms of games, my lord, there's just a ridiculous amount. Codemasters is one of the most iconic names in the world of British gaming, and they are absolutely nothing to be sniffed at. How many big franchises do you want? Dizzy, Colin McRae, Operation Flashpoint, Seymour, Music, Toker, the tons of simulator games? You could easily spend a full and big video covering one of these game series. You could get absolutely lost in a library that's proportional in size to the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark. It is intimidating, to be sure. Although Codemasters is a subject that's been requested many times, I've often shied away from it. Hell, this is far from my first attempt at trying to do a video on Codemasters. There have been plenty of failures. You have a look at this monolith and, well, where do you even start? It's hard to actually find that angle of attack. But I think, finally, I have managed to find an approach that will work. Covering every single game is, of course, impossible. I mean, you can try, but there are hundreds. Even covering all of their simulator games, which I actually have done in the past, is a daunting proposition. So really, the games are kind of immaterial in many ways. We'll certainly be looking and touching on a few, particularly my favourites, but in-depth looks at series like Dizzy, again, they deserve to be on their own, whether it's a video by me or another great person who also happens to do documentary style videos on the retro gaming world. And hell, even then a complete look at Codemasters is a wearying prospect. What happens when we get to the modern age? Do I get stuck in some purgatory of endless racing games? Now don't get me wrong, Codemasters are pretty good at racing games, that's quite clear. But personally, modern racing games aren't something I enjoy too much. Looking at endless takes on F1 or Dirt or Grid and all that is kinda gonna be a damp squib of an ending, in other words. No, the answer is to stick to their classic period, from the beginning in and around 1987 up until about 1999. What we have here is, well, a road to respect. In the days of the Spectrum, Codemasters were essentially side-eyed by just about everyone else in the industry, in the press by the serious players. They were one of the last big companies to come out of the 8-bit micro generation, after all, and I wonder how many people in the industry liked them. Other companies may have seen them as Johnny-come-latelys from a highly privileged background, a bunch of rich kids who were wet behind the ears and taken advantage. It's easy to take one look at the Darling brothers, so young, fresh-faced and impeccable, and dismiss them for a perceived lack of sheer bloody hard graft at the coding coalface. Their suave PR and slick operation kinda flew in the face of the usual bedroom coder stereotype, after all. And that so happened to be co-built by another very decisive industry figure, so there's that to consider. And they were a budget game studio, meaning that, you know, they're undercutters. What are these bastards doing, climbing up the charts with their cheap games available at the local corner shop for a couple of quid a pop? What's going to happen to the full price market? Hell, what's going to happen to the computer game store? Some may see a budget game studio like Codemasters to be, well, almost a harbinger of doom. When the budget studios come, well, to quote Churchill, it's not the end, it may not even be the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. In many ways, it's a similar story for the magazines and the like. The traditional gaming press were quite outspoken about Codemasters' less savoury practices, and a fair bit of the time they had good reason to be. No major company were exactly innocent in this regard, but Codies would always get a serious kick in. The quotes that often adorned their games, the absolutely brilliant and all that, were like old gaming memes, dismissed for pretending to be quotes from journalists when they were usually only attributable to a Codies employee. And of course, with the amount of games they released, it is fair to say that Codies did put out quite a few stinkers. Even if a big chunk of their work was quality, anything that missed the mark would certainly be pounced upon with gusto. It's fair to say then that, as successful as they were, to a point where quite frankly they dominated the entire 8-bit micro market, they weren't necessarily liked by a lot of people. But that would change, and we're going to cover that change and how it happened, through the original excellent games they made back in the day, courtesy of brilliant programmers from the Darlings themselves, another high profile set of twins and others, to the other ways that they gained respect, through ultimately convincing other big companies that they had to follow their example, through their constant embracing of new technology, and even their creations of gaming innovations. Some of them did fail, but others were spectacular, through taking on the biggest and most vicious gaming company in the world in a courtroom and winning, and ultimately through surviving the leap from 2D into 3D and becoming one of the UK's top producers of high quality console games. From absolutely brilliant to genius at play, this is Codemasters' Road to Respect. And no matter where the story ends, obviously we have to start at the beginning. The childhood existence of Codemasters' co-founders, Richard and David Darling, aka the Darling brothers, is kind of an odd one. In some ways similar to that of other big names in the industry, in other ways different. The Darlings most certainly have their origin stories of many hours spent during and after school on the computer, learning how to code. Sometimes they'd use a keyboard, other times they'd go seriously old school and use punch cards. Like many of their peers, they had a teacher who told them that they should stop focusing their emerging talents on games because it was a waste of time, but they also had inspirations too, chief among them most probably being their father, James Darling. Now, to talk about just the Darling brothers is, in fact, almost a little erroneous. Codemasters was formed as a family business, and dear old Dad is going to be a very central figure indeed. James Darling would eventually be the Codemasters company chairman. Before that, James Darling was a very successful pioneer in the field of contact lenses. His work and talents took the Darling family just about all over the world. Throughout their early lives, the Darlings would live in the UK, in the Netherlands, Austria, France, Canada, Australia, on land and in the sea, just about everywhere before finally settling in Somerset. Programming games quickly became the Darlings' passion, and in fact they were there pretty much at the beginning. Before Codemasters, Richard and David had another brand, Galactic Software, started in 1983 when they were only 16 years old, making and selling games for the VIC-20. These initial efforts, sold from the back pages of Popular Computing Weekly, made the young Darlings a nice little bit of cash, and it also made an impression with studios. Soon they were contacted by Mastertronic and they started freelancing for them in the mid-80s, generally releasing games on their MAD label with the C64 as their main platform. Appropriate enough, seeing as the Darlings further honed their skills in childhood on a pet they had at home. Some of these games would become quite well known. The Last V8 is a very tricky top-down racing game indeed with a post-apocalyptic Mad Max influence. Not necessarily a great game as the controls are seriously ropey, although it was blessed with an incredible soundtrack courtesy of Rob Hubbard. Similarly, there's BMX Racers, which in many ways is the forerunner to what the Darlings would do, much more famously with BMX Simulator, fast-paced cycling all the way. Not a good game again, although this was, surprisingly enough, a huge seller for Mastertronic. Big hit. Master of Magic, originally by Richard Darling, is perhaps the best loved of these early Darlings titles. Rated very highly by Zap64, it's a role-playing game that's surprisingly deep and, again, comes with a classic Rob Hubbard soundtrack. Other games are less well known, of course. You have Pigs in Space, which is a thinly disguised take on the arcade game Pooyan, or other straightforward multi-screen titles like Mind Control, Spacewalk and Magic Carpet. Still, this early work is successful indeed, especially for two brothers who, let's not forget, are still only teenagers. They were living out the true bedroom coder's dream. Before they were 20, they had already made 200 grand. In fact, they were making more than their father. And so at this point, James Darling got involved, helping to manage the burgeoning business. In Mastertronic, they had an ideal partner. Richard Alper's publishing house were one of the original successful names in the budget world. Hell, without Mastertronic, there would have never been a Codemasters. It was chiefly them who helped to restore the reputation of budget games. In the early days, budget games were often dismissed as total trash because, well, they were in many cases, and shops had been burned far too many times by terrible budget games to back them in any serious way. It was Alpa and Mastertronic who helped persuade the shops to get back on the side of budget games, with the help of titles that showed that low price didn't have to translate to low quality. The Darlings could have easily had a big role to play in the still young Mastertronic. Indeed, they had a 50% share in the company at one point. And yet they saw that they could have so much more if they went alone. It's a riskier road, of course, but the Darlings felt they were capable enough and different enough as people. They got on handsomely, but Richard and David certainly have their own sets of strengths. And so, they sold their shares in Mastertronic and went alone. In 1986, still only 19, the Darlings set up Codemasters with the help of their father and elder sister Abigail, working out of a small office in an industrial park in Banbury, Oxfordshire. It also wouldn't be too long before they picked up another guy, someone who was already pretty well known in the industry. Enter Brucey. Bruce Everis is someone we have already seen a good few times. He is, of course, and perhaps still is to this day, most famous for being an integral part of the original Imagine software in Liverpool, meaning that yes, of course, we are currently showing clips from the immortal Commercial Breaks BBC TV documentary for the millionth time. We've seen him many times, walking forlornly around a near-empty office with demotivated coders mere days before the bailiffs arrived, the captain of a sinking ship. He is a decisive figure. Few are quite as forthright and outspoken as he, after all, and many don't necessarily agree with his views on most everything. We've already kind of covered his MO. I'd imagine he was in many ways responsible for inventing the bedroom coder success story. With Eugene Evans and John Gibson as his primary mascots, for lack of a better word, he would send stories out to the press about how Eugene was barely out of school and driving around in a Lotus, or how John had given up his previous line of work and was now making loads of money, enough to fulfil his dream of flying around in propeller planes. That sort of thing. Everis, the pure and uncut Thatcherite entrepreneurial marketing mogul, sold the bedroom coder dream at Imagine until, thanks to ridiculous overreach, comical mismanagement, and a million or so other factors, most of which to be fair were well beyond his control, it became a nightmare. He took a chance with Codemasters pretty early on. Almost as soon as the company had opened up, Bruce made his way down to Banbury and offered his services in marketing. He convinced the Darlings of his vision, and he was in. While he was only at Cody's for a couple of years, we are covering possibly his chief success story here, even if we could say a lot of good and bad about Bruce Everis. At Codemasters he essentially ran the bedroom coder playbook again, albeit with some refinement. And of course he had a great advantage. With Codemasters he could market a studio that could actually back up big claims with quality titles. He didn't really have that at Imagine. John Gibson was very talented, but pulled in many directions to the point where his work was negatively affected by the Imagine merry-go-round, same as their other talented coders like Ian Weatherburn and David Lawson. Eugene Evans' considerable industry talents would turn out to be in areas other than game design, and there was of course the whole ridiculous company in masses of debt essentially pouring money into a blazing fire issue. But the Darlings, well, these young hotheads could do the business. From October 1986 onwards, Codemasters hit the ground running. Their first title, BMX Simulator, was a big critical and commercial hit. A top-down cycling game in somewhat of a similar vein to Super Sprint is one of those debuts that basically sets out the stall immediately. For just a couple of quid, you're going to get a proper full game that's appealing straight out of the stalls, that looked pretty sharp, and was more than a match for a full-price game. This was the Codemasters remit. Just because it's budget doesn't mean it shouldn't be the best it can possibly be. And it worked, which for other companies was the scary thing. After all, what would you rather shove into your C64? The perfectly competent but full-price official conversion of Super Sprint? Or BMX Simulator? If you didn't know any better, which one would you say was the full-price title? It's not so clear-cut, is it? Throughout Codemasters' first full year, the hits would keep on coming. Having kick-started with a simulator, naturally more would follow. BMX Simulator is soon joined by Grand Prix Simulator, Fruit Machine Simulator, and ATV Simulator. And once again they're all high-quality titles. Tim Miller's ATV is another simple and highly addictive racing platforming hybrid that does a fantastic job for a couple of quid. Something like Mark Baldock's Fruit Machine Simulator may not seem like much on paper, but when you actually play it, it's weirdly enticing. And Grand Prix Simulator continues the popular top-down racing formula. Not only that, it's one of the first Cody's games created by another famous brotherly duo. The Darlings first met Andrew and Philip, the Oliver twins, at a trade show in Hammersmith, and it would be the start of a very successful relationship. The Olivers were just a perfect fit. They had a similar story to the Darlings in that they'd had the usual school days spent learning code, and they'd even already appeared on TV. In 1983, they won a competition and made an appearance on the Saturday show. So now Codemasters had not one, but two photogenic and media-savvy duos to call on, and again the Olivers could more than back it up. Right from their first Codemasters title, the excellent platformer Super Robin Hood, they were Codemasters aces. While they had plenty of other talented coders working for them, it was only really the Oliver twins who could command that front page billing, eventually to the point where the names of the Olivers would be just as prominent as the name of the company on their games. The Olivers name in and of itself was a seller. And this is before their really big series even comes into view. We'll get to that, of course. But we can enjoy some other solid titles. Terra Cognita, Super Stuntman, Transmuter, and even the odd Spanish import such as the excellent platformer Fantomas. Before their first year was out, Codemasters had already racked up 5 #1 titles and had established themselves as one of the top publishers in the whole country. Another big factor of this was their consistent and very solid branding. Alistair Graham, Cody's main cover artist, created a bright look that stood out on the shelves, all primary colours and eye-catching drawings. The blue and yellow pretty much became synonymous with Codemasters, as did the sillier little quirks. Why exactly did they release so many games with that simulator suffix? It's pretty simple really. They started off with a successful simulator game. The Darlings quickly noted that adding simulator to the title of the game, for whatever reason, made it fly off the shelves faster. In the words of David Darling in Retrogamer, the word simulator seemed to make a game sell 10 times better. And so naturally it got used a lot more. Eventually it reached a level that was beyond parody, but certainly in the early days it was effective and accurate. Cody's wanted to make games like Grand Prix Simulator, or Professional Ski Simulator, or Advanced Pinball Simulator, as good as they could possibly be within the limitations of the system. And what of the two words that became a trademark? Absolutely brilliant. Well, that was originally a quote from Cody's employee and later operations manager Stuart Regan, and pretty soon it would be joined by other quotes from Cody's people, a guarantee of quality I suppose. Of course, to some it could look a little like a quote from a magazine, as did their whole patter when introducing their games on the inlays and whatever. It could all be a bit cringy. But it was effective and continued to be as the Cody's empire expanded, soon taking in much more freelance work from enthusiastic young coders, picked up by ads in PCW that would promote perfectly respectable 4-figure commissions for converting Codemasters' hit titles to the other 8-bit micro platforms. While they started out primarily on C64, and other Cody's guys had their own preferences, Oliver Twins were Amstrad CPC people for example, it quickly got to the stage where you couldn't really pin Codemasters down to a specific platform. Spectrum, C64, Amstrad, they were amongst the top studios on all 3. As we head into 1987, Codemasters' future is as bright as their game's cover art, and it's only going to get brighter from here. So, it's the middle of 1987. Bruce Everest, having achieved what he set out to do at Codemasters, decides to take his leave from the company for the time being. By this time they're already pretty well set on their way. But now it's time for the Oliver Twins to unleash their signature series. They'd already hit the mark several times. Super Robin Hood and Grand Prix Simulator were both smashers. They'd also released the odd but still quite effective platform shooter hybrid game Ghost Hunters. This is a hard game, but the concept of playing a platformer while also controlling a crosshair on the screen actually works out pretty well. The Darlings were certainly big fans of their work, although admittedly they would have rather they continued along the path of producing simple yet effective games of the Grand Prix Simulator variety. That's what sold after all. but the Olivers had something a little different in mind. When they first came to the Darlings with the concept of a platformer where you control an egg who rolls around everywhere, that also included the sort of puzzles you'd often find in text adventures, the Cody's co-founders didn't exactly see its selling potential. It was a bit too quirky, a bit too different from the usual micro-platformer formula, a game that didn't rely on the accurate to the point of pixel-perfect jumps required in most micro-platformers since Manic Miner, but one where controlling the character was a lot looser, seeing as the egg would often be rolling around out of your control. Still, the Darlings gave it the go-ahead based on the Olivers' previous big hits, with one change. The generic title of Magic Kingdom was changed to Dizzy the Ultimate Cartoon Adventure, presumably because controlling this character could make you dizzy, with your head spinning and so on. In any case, David Darling was quite convinced that the game would be a flop. Perhaps the character itself put him off. Dizzy itself wasn't necessarily the cutest of heroes, and some may have even found the concept of a walking egg with eyes to be somewhat freaky. But it was certainly an attention grabber either way. At first, David Darling was proved right. Initial sales for Dizzy were poor, considerably less than the typical Cody simulator titles. Never one to crow too much, David immediately consoled the Olivers by printing a t-shirt for them that said, "I told you so," on the front of it. However, the game reviewed very well in the magazines, and word of mouth spread about the game. Those initial sales numbers never dropped off, and indeed, they were soon growing. By the time the second game, Treasure Island Dizzy, came along, the egg was a star. Treasure Island went straight to the top of the charts and sold around 300,000 copies, while increasing the sales of the first game once again. Codemasters had more than just a successful series. In Dizzy, they had their mascot, and later games in the series would continue to sell in huge numbers. The classic Dizzy formula persisted throughout, a bit of collection, a bit of puzzle solving, and a very personable little world, just instantly appealing. Sometimes the games would feature some fiendish and obtuse puzzles that may well have required the use of the Codemasters premium rate helpline, which, helpfully enough, was always visible in the series' first game, a little sneaky but surely a money spinner, but they would always be welcome. It got to the point where they'd even feature plenty of in-game adverts for other games, another Cody's trademark, or little bits of insider humour, such as the ability to pick up a totally useless copy of Sinclair Abuser magazine in Treasure Island Dizzy, parodying the magazine's Sinclair user. It's often said that this was in response to some perceived slight in the pages of Emaps magazine, but that wasn't the case. It was actually in reference to the Olivers sending a little gift to the officers of Sinclair User in the shape of, well, let's be honest, a rather grotesque plushie of the venerable egg. Sinclair User, being the young gamers that they were, responded by tying up the plushie, torturing it, and printing the results in their magazine. Codemasters responded with a press release registering their disappointment at the journo's horrifying act. And that's where the Sinclair Abuser reference came from. The culmination of some rather amusing but effective marketing. All in good fun, I suppose. Well, hasn't everyone done the odd callous act to a plushie from time to time? Anybody? Dizzy added another big set of strings to the old Codemasters bow, particularly as the exploits of the egg expanded even further. Soon he's joined by a bunch of characters known as the Yoke Folk, and the main adventures of the egg would soon be joined by a load of spin-off games of varying quality, from the very good likes of Fast Food Dizzy and Quick Snacks, to the somewhat less appealing games like Bubble Dizzy and Dizzy Down the Rapids. But still, all of this was being done at a budget price point. Codemasters were resolutely sticking to that £2 to £3 mark. Later on they'd go up to £4 with the launch of their Quattro range. It's £1 more than their usual fare, but for that money you're getting 4 Codemasters titles on one tape, so it's still hardly a bad deal. It's something that the big companies have to take notice of, and they ultimately have to respond. Not just to Codemasters, of course, but to other big budget names like Mastertronic. Soon these companies will launch their own budget labels, populated entirely by successful games from years past. Ocean Software have the Hit Squad, US Gold have Kicks, Gremlin have GBH, Elite have Encore, and so on. But even if Cody's games are now competing against grand old hits on the shop shelves, they're still shining in the sales department. It's a fair fight all the way. Mostly. As we near the end of the 1980s, the quality of Codemasters' output generally remains strong. There's certainly lots to mention aside from Dizzy. You've got sequels to the likes of BMX, Grand Prix and Fruit Machine Simulator. There's the arrival of another hotshot programmer by the name of Colin Jones, creator of the gloriously irreverent and still somewhat funny in an immature way music mogul and tabloid parody mashup Rockstar Ate My Hamster, where you take a set of stars, get them as much publicity as possible without accidentally killing them, try not to run out of money, and hopefully make your way to the top of the charts in a blaze of rude song titles, scantily clad models, and benefit gigs for the Nuke Your Granny Society. While Dizzy becomes the Oliver's main focus, they still score big with games like Professional Ski Simulator and Sport Aid benefit title The Race Against Time. There's even the oddly enticing likes of Monte Carlo Casino and Pub Trivia. You wouldn't think these games would be appealing, but just like the Fruit Machine games, they are. Still, there are also a few little duffers. Codemasters do start to use the simulator name just a little bit too much, attaching it to any old shoot 'em up or sports game or whatever. Some of them, like 4-Soccer Simulators or Powerboat Simulator or Rallycross Simulator, just aren't any good. The worst of the lot, and something they got a serious bollocking for in mags, was when they took an old and rather average Superior Software boxing title called By Fair Means or Foul and re-released it as Pro Boxing Simulator, having the chutzpah to plaster "new release" on the cover. It was quickly pointed out that it wasn't a new release. The mags gave Cody's a frightful wigging, and the cover art was soon changed. None of this really affects the company's considerably high sales numbers, of course. As the 8-bit micro era nears its sunset, Codemasters are right there at the top with not a whole lot else to prove. And so it's time to look at new lands and, indeed, new machines. The last couple of years for Codemasters on the 8-bit micro still offers up some quality titles, of course. Aside from the usual round of simulators, there's certainly a lot more platformers around. Indeed, quite a lot of them were in the Dizzy vein, with Codemasters trying to catch that fire once more with other cute and smiley shapes or animals and what have you. Seymour is probably the most famous of these Dizzy wannabes. He was originally born out of the Darlings asking the Olivers to create a Dizzy game that took place in a real-life setting. The Olivers refused, wanting to keep the egg firmly in Fantasyland, and so the Darlings instead employed Big Red Software to make Seymour, a quite Dizzy-esque character with a bit more attitude, a bit more fitting perhaps for 1990. The games had a strong enough presence but weren't quite of the Dizzy standard. The first one, Seymour Goes to Hollywood, tried to capture the Dizzy formula but lacked the strong design. Generally the series did better later on when it took a simpler arcade route. Those were alright, the Dizzy-esque games, no. CJ the Elephant was another one. Again, there's lots of attempts at personality, but the games weren't there. The likes of CJ's Elephant antics are so-so at best. There are other lesser lights here of varying quality, from general duffers like Little Puff the Magic Dragon to the quite decent Turbo the Tortoise, not to mention Murray Mouse, Bigfoot, Big Nose, Steg the Slug, Captain Dynamo. But still, Dizzy was kin. His later titles, such as Magic Land Dizzy, Prince of the Oakfolk and Spellbound, continue to sell very nicely, even as we enter the last years of the 8-bit generation. The Olivers could still very much be counted on. At one point they were even credited for 7% of all UK game sales. Outside of these games, there's a lot of other quite nice 8 and 16-bit microcomputer games that perhaps didn't take up the spotlight quite as much, but are still pretty good. Colin Jones returns with the bouncy and colourful Slightly Magic, a thoroughly decent puzzle platformer. Prince Clumsy's another really good one. It's kind of like a sillier take on Ghosts and Goblins and actually works out really nice. Spike in Transylvania is a little hidden gem, a more traditional arcade adventure which is frankly tons of fun. And the Oliver twins do something a little different for Firehawk, an action game which plays like a cheaper and top-down but still effective take on the Strike games. While there's also stinkers like DJ Puff, Wrestling Superstars and Guardian Angel, there's still a fair bit of good coming out there. Still, while Codemasters stick with the 8-bit micros right up to the very end, not even closing up shop on systems like Lespecki until 1993, at the start of the decade they're looking to move on. A more natural step would be to shift towards the 16-bit micro platforms, the Amiga and the Atari ST, and certainly a lot of their games were released on those. And yet it never quite felt like Codemasters considered platforms like the Amiga to fully be a home. They were much more attracted by shifting towards consoles and selling games at a higher price on a cartridge format. It was obvious that something like a Dizzy game, were it a hit on a console system on the same level as it were on a computer, would make a hell of a lot more cash as a result. Simple and fair enough. That wasn't necessarily the only reason. For a British budget software house, Codemasters weren't ones to shy away from innovation, and they were pretty eager to change with the times. Here's one of their great oddities. In 1989 they released something called the CD Games Pack, featuring 30 of their classic games on a compact disc for the Spectrum, Amstrad and C64. Wait, hold on, what? Loading games on these systems from CD? In 1989? Why, yes. How did it work? Well, the CD pack came with a special 3.5mm to DE9 cable. The 3.5mm end goes into your CD player, and the DE9 goes into a Kempston or Sinclair interface, where you'd usually put a joystick. It also comes with a cassette containing a small loader program. You load this into the machine, and then pick from one of the 30 games, which it then loads from the CD. Niftier. Using the higher bitrate from a CD track, it's even cut down loading times. It would take about a minute to load any particular game as opposed to the 3 to 5 minutes it would take normally, just because of the better quality. The whole thing didn't exactly catch on and sell in big numbers, but still, it's quite a weird and fun workaround. So anyway, back to cartridges. With a switch towards cartridges, Cody's also had their eyes on America and on making a name for themselves there, which eventually in a roundabout sort of way they would do. At this time, around about 1989 or so, the platform of choice in the States was very much still the Nintendo Entertainment System. A visit to the almighty CES Expo at the start of the year showed the darlings just how big the game was over there, so to speak. Although, coming from the world of software publishing in the UK, where basically anything goes, adhering to Nintendo's ultra-tight controls on their platform didn't exactly appeal to Cody's at all. And so they took the same steps certain other folks did, the likes of Tengen or Colour Dreams and what have you. They entered into the unlicensed games world. They partnered up with a Canadian video game company named Camerica, who released their games on gold and black cartridges, complete with the requisite switch to crash the NES 10 lockout chip. Codemasters NES games are a strange and mostly decent bunch. A lot of people actually do think of Codemasters as one of, if not the best maker of unlicensed games for the NES during those years. Mind you, that's not high praise when their competitors were the likes of Bible game makers Wisdom Tree or anti-drug game makers American Video Entertainment. Largely though, you've got some good uns. Naturally a big chunk of them had already been seen on the micros. Games like MiG-29 Soviet Fighter, BMX Simulator, Super Robin Hood and Firehawk had proved their worth already, after all. As did some of the older Dizzy games. Treasure Island Dizzy and Prince of the Yokefolk, released under the name Dizzy the Adventurer, would also come out. Then there's some of the quirkier original releases. Big Nose Freaks Out is a really good NES exclusive platformer, for example. Not bad at all considering that the other micro-releases featuring this particular caveman were somewhat middling. B-52 also has a certain charm as a cutesy-ish shooter in the Defender vein. Of course there's others that do miss the mark a bit. Linus Spacehead's Cosmic Adventure, later known as Cosmic Spacehead, is a mixture of point and click and platforming that doesn't shine in either department. And of course there is the silly, so bad it's good, all-out action and utterly ludicrous The Ultimate Stuntman, which you may well have a laugh at, although as far as gameplay goes it's kind of a total dock. Great music though. Still, two games stand out over everything else. The first one, which we'll be covering further in the next chapter, is the original 1991 release of Micro Machines. This is obviously a huge deal indeed, as it's the start of another one of Cody's biggest franchises, and is indeed for many the best game the company ever released, so it needs a bit more space. Secondly, there's the Dizzy game that was built purely for the Nintendo, The Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy, usually shortened to Fantastic Dizzy. A much bigger and more epic adventure for the egg than just about every other Dizzy game combined, it was hoped that this would be a bigger rival for the Little Blighter. It was hoped that 500,000 copies of this game would be shifted. But alas, while it's very good to the point of being one of the best entries in the whole series, it never got close to that number. And a lot of that was down to Cody's biggest controversy, the one surrounding what may well be their biggest contribution to the gaming world at that time. Coming from the UK computing world, it seemed so very natural to the darlings. If you owned a game, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to modify it a little. Not in an utterly transformative way, of course, but just in a simple way like, say, adjusting the amount of lives or energy you were given. On a platform like Lespecki or Amstrad or C64, this was just another part of the experience. Having trouble with a game? Well, have a look in the back of your favourite magazine, because you may well find a poke that will sort out all your troubles. You punch that in when you load up the game, and you're laughing. Pokes were second nature back then. Devices soon came out that made the whole process even easier. The inspiration for Codemasters' eventual creation, the Game Genie, lay in the very popular Multiface by Romantic Robot. Plug this baby in the back of your micro and you can do anything. You can enter pokes for days, you can take a screenshot of your game, you can save in games where you wouldn't usually be able to. Hell, you could even back the whole game up to the device and dump it somewhere else. Now, the Game Genie was never going to do anything like that, but it was certainly going to make the process of cheating in any game perfectly straightforward, even in games that didn't have any cheat codes. Ultimately, the Genie was unleashed onto the NES in the middle of 1990, distributed in the States by the toy company Galoob. No one had foreseen any problems. Everyone from Comerica to the darlings had even tried to get in touch with the Big N to see if they could get an official license for the product, but they found that they were strangely quiet on the matter. Almost as soon as the Genie hit the shelves, before you could so much as touch any kind of lamp, everyone got their answer on that. Nintendo hated it. They saw the Game Genie as a modification that, in essence, created an unauthorised derivative work, and they promptly sued Galoob and Comerica based on that. A knock-on effect of this was that for a time the distribution of Codemasters' NES games was stopped, thus putting a kibosh on the expected sales for Fantastic Dizzy. But to Codemasters' mind, Nintendo's case hardly had a leg to stand on. Hell, Nintendo themselves released controllers that added functions like rapid fire to any game, which was in itself a modification. Was that really too much different to what the Game Genie offered? Not to mention that any changes that the Genie made to a game's code were temporary. As soon as the machine was powered off, those changes disappeared. There was no way to make them permanent or to publish that changed version. It was a fair argument, and it was one that convinced the judge. And so, Galoob and Comerica won. Not only that, Galoob immediately countersued Nintendo for damages of over $15 million, and in 1991 they won that case too. For once, the biggest and most vicious of all the games companies, one that certainly had a fair bit of experience on the inside of a courtroom, had been given a bloody nose. The path was cleared for the Game Genie to become a massive peripheral, with versions sold on just about every 90s console and handheld. In the end, the whole thing works out pretty bloody well for Codemasters. Still, Codemasters' time on the NES came to an end in 1992. It happens in a weird way. In the later part of the year, Comerica starts marketing a product called the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, which it is hoped will increase the commercial life of the machine. Of course, it's not really an enhancer as such. What it is a way to distribute games cheaper than they would be if you stuck them in a cartridge. The end user buys a deck enhancer, plonks it into their NES, and then they can buy the much smaller game cards for it, which cost a great deal less than a regular NES cartridge, only $20 or so. It's not bad, and a bunch of games are announced for it, including new entries in the Dizzy world such as Wonderland Dizzy and Dream World Pogi, but in the end only 7 games ever came out for the enhancer. At the start of 1993, and somewhat unexpectedly, Comerica went to the wall. The sales for the deck enhancer were perhaps not as good as expected, and it was enough to kill them. Lots of enhancers were made, and some speculate that there are still plenty out there, sitting on pallets in long-forgotten warehouses. But that was the abrupt end of Codemasters' time with the NES. A bit of wrangling over the titles that were left in limbo on the enhancer also put an end to the Oliver twins' relationship with the Darling brothers. They decided to move on. Dizzy itself ended with its final full-price incarnation, Crystal Kingdom Dizzy, in 1992, although Fantastic Dizzy would also find a very cosy little home on the Mega Drive in 93. For Codemasters, it's time to move on again, this time towards the land of Sega. The departure of the Oliver twins and arrival onto the Sega Mega Drive signals another little change for Codemasters. Weirdly, in many ways, the changes brought them back to what had originally brought them a whole load of attention in the first place. While naturally people had a lot of expectations for seeing something along the lines of a brand new and even bigger Dizzy game on the Mega Drive, the excellent conversion of Fantastic Dizzy would be all that they got. Instead, Cody's found themselves making another smash with another top-down racer, albeit one on a level beyond what they previously had with the venerable BMX simulator. The process for what would eventually become Micro Machines started almost at the same time as Cody's had started making games for the NES. One of their young programmers, Andrew Graham, started fiddling around with a speedy top-down racer that involved being able to jump about and generally knock all the other cars around all over the shop. This little thing gradually grew from being a test program into a game, and at first it was known as California Buggy Boys. Then, when Codemasters set up the initial agreement with Galoob for them to sell the Game Genie, Galoob floated the idea of Cody's creating a game based on their popular line of miniature toy cars. And the rest, as they say, is history. The original 1991 NES Micro Machines is a pretty fine game, of course. It's kinda hard to think of the game's origin as being an unlicensed game on Nintendo, but there it is. It was certainly a big enough hit, even in that area, for it to be more than a match for any regular old Big N approved title. But when the game was remade and re-released for the Mega Drive in 1993, it well and truly found a home, becoming a massive hit indeed. It's a game that's pretty obviously made for multiplayer, bashing all your friends off the course in many fiendish ways, but it's charming enough in general that it's fun no matter what, if not also quite challenging. The tracks were always perhaps the most charming thing about it. The sand dunes and the like that were initially going to make up the tracks in California Buggy Boys found themselves replaced by workbenches, bathtubs, breakfast tables, pool tables, and even toilet seats. The game was absolutely loved and reviewed handsomely just about all the way. Aside from the CDI version, I suppose, but then that was another little example of Cody's trying out something a little bit new. While Andrew Graham didn't work on the equally excellent sequel, 1994's Micro Machines 2 Turbo Tournament, the lads at frequent Cody's collaborators Supersonic Software did a fine job, switching up the controls to make the game even faster and drifty, while even doing some other rather amusing things like adding Violet Berlin from Bad Influence into the game, albeit only as the second fastest racer. The honour of being fastest always has to go to the almighty Spider. The sequel was, if anything, even more of a smash than the first title. Micro Machines 2 is also, by far, the most common site for one of Codemasters' other little and much loved innovations, something called the J-Cart. With Micro Machines being a game that in the mind of Cody's was best enjoyed by 4 players, they wanted everyone who bought the game to be able to experience that, and so they built a cartridge with 2 controller ports on the front of it, foregoing the need to buy a separate multi-tap, at least for this game. The J-Cart actually got its first run out on certain versions of the pretty nifty tennis tie-in title Pete Sampras Tennis earlier in 1994, where it was possible to play simultaneous 4-player doubles, but Micro Machines 2 is by far its most famous incarnation. Indeed, it only ever appeared on a couple of games, mainly all Micro Machines ones. That the J-Cart is still so well remembered these days is kind of a testament to just how popular the Micro Machines games were, specifically the second one. Later entries in the series never got close to that mark, even if they were still pretty successful. The 1996 update to Turbo Tournament added a track editor, which was more welcome on PC than it was on consoles. Micro Machines Military added weapons which you either loved or hated. The later 3D update, Micro Machines V3, gave the races a different look and added speech samples to the lot of them. Almost everyone hated those, eventually including Andrew Graham and the original developers themselves, who grew to see them as a waste of time that got old quickly, subtracting from the immediacy of the original games. Still, Micro Machines 1 and 2, almost on their own, are enough to make this series one of Codemasters' biggest and best loved. They're certainly way up there, with the original NES Micro Machines being David Darlin's personal pick as his favourite of all the Codemasters games. There are some other pretty cool titles to look at in Codemasters' Mega Drive game library. By this point they're really not releasing too much in the way of stinkers. You've got perfectly fine sports titles like the aforementioned Pete Sampras Tennis, or the start of their Brian Lara Cricket series. Andrew Graham also made a pretty nice pinball game. Psycho Pinball is one of the best you'll find on the Mega Drive, and it even comes complete with a very 90s CD of music indeed. I mean, just look at that cover art. One that should also be picked out as a definite hidden gem is the fantastic little puzzle game Man Overboard. Originally an Amiga game and only picked up by Codemasters for publishing on Sega machines, this is a great little game of marshalling your shipmates around and making sure they don't accidentally put a lemon-style end to themselves. Lovely. The 8-bit and handheld Sega machines also got a bit of love too, with solid conversions of the likes of Micro Machines and even, shock of all horrors, a half-decent game starring CJ the Elephant on the Game Gear. By this stage, with Codemasters now firmly in the full-price console world, they've become a name that more and more people could depend on, always getting good reviews in the magazines. Sometimes they would have the odd run-in with Sega. They still largely operated on the system without technically having a Sega license, certainly at first, although the ground rules on the Mega Drive were much looser in that regard than they were on, say, the NES. It was only on the next platform that they'd go fully licensed and legit, so to speak. And there's still a good few games to look at in the final part, on PlayStation. Codemasters and PlayStation seemed like a pretty natural fit for a company that still, at this stage, had quite the British identity. Things were generally cosier here on this platform for the Brits. And indeed they would largely stick with Sony exclusively. Their only console release in the 32-bit generation outside of the PlayStation was an N64 version of Micro Machines V3. And it was here on the PlayStation where they would do, for many, arguably their best work to date. Again, it's certainly different from the likes of Dizzy or even Micro Machines. The PlayStation is really where Codemasters would start creating the detailed and more serious racing games that have grown to define the studio right up to the present day. It's the start of the almighty Colin McRae franchise and the Race Driver franchise, then known as Toka. There's a big shift towards mostly racing and sports games, with the continuation of other brands like Pete Sampras and Brian Lara, as well as the addition of World Championship Soccer, Jonah Lomu Rugby, and the popular football management series LMA Manager. And there is room for something a bit more unique, working with a studio named Jester on the very popular Music. Codemasters were certainly in a more comfy spot than a lot of other studios were come the time of the jump from 16-bit to 32-bit, or from 2D to largely 3D. Even despite their runaway success, they hadn't really gone overboard with it all. There are perhaps less of the silly rock and roll stories here that you may sometimes find when looking at other big studios, but Cody's were just a bit more focused perhaps. Or boring, if you'd prefer. They always had one eye on the future to see what was coming, and laid back to the PlayStation pretty early on as their console of choice. They'd gradually upgraded their business without getting outrageous. The days of a small little space in Banbury were long gone, now replaced by plusher and larger offices in the quiet town of Southam, in Warwickshire. Sort of a little bit like Rare in this regard, they preferred the country to the big city. They had a considerable filofax of coders and studios, past and present, who they could rely on. There's a lot to be said about the contributions over the years from the likes of Big Red and Supersonic Software, even if they are a little bit more anonymous than the ones made by, say, the Oliver Twins. They were in a pretty comfy position all the way through, with no sign of them having the same troubles that ultimately befell the likes of Ocean. Perhaps this is where you see the true strength of the quieter brother. While David Darling's the more front-facing one who focuses a lot more on the games, Richard Darling ultimately pivoted more towards the running of the business and generally shied away from media. They're both different but utterly indispensable. You could not have one without the other. For anyone who spent a lot of time in PlayStation back in the day, Codemasters were a pretty bloody solid name. Not only were their games good, but they were also pretty state-of-the-art for the time. Colin McRae Rally 1 and 2 are perhaps the best of them, the definite shining example. Initially an arcade rally game very much inspired by the almighty Sega Rally, the addition of the legendary Scottish driver on the front ended up giving things a bit more of a simulator sheen, while still retaining the arcade playability. And with the help of cheat codes you could even run the game at full speed and in widescreen, which is certainly something quite special to see on original PS1 hardware. The sequel, 2.0, more of the same and even better in all honesty. This and Toka are right up there when it comes to racing games on the PS1. Even if Gran Turismo is understandably at the top of the tree on the platform for many people, these games really aren't too behind when it comes to racing, and they may even offer a bit more of an accessible experience. And of course we can't not mention music a little, can we? Music creation software on the PS1 seems like a weird thing to push, but there was enough accessibility in music and enough of a kooky Y2K aesthetic for the game to be a big success. Pushed heavily indeed by magazines, it certainly sold a lot. Not too bad for a load of samples and a generally basic sequencer, but the more creative-minded folk out there could certainly get something pretty cool out of it. Even in odd places like this, Codemasters were consistent enough by this point that most things they released had a pretty solid chance of success. Music, along with the incredible racing games, is a pretty good summation of just where they were and what they'd done to get there. And so, well, this is probably a good place to stop, right at the turn of the millennium. Things do change gradually as we go through the 2000s and the PS2 era. There'll still be plenty of great games, both racing and non-racing, but certainly more and more racing games will be coming to the point where eventually the company became purely a racing game studio, albeit a very good one. Gradually other companies took shares, specifically the equity group Balderton Capital, and in 2007 the Darlings decided to take their leave from the company they'd formed, moving on to head up mobile game makers Quali in the 2010s. Certainly in terms of games we could go on and on. It's a shame that we're not going to see the likes of the utterly amazing Toka 3, not to mention Bohemia Interactive's massively influential Operation Flashpoint. But it's best to draw a line at a place where Codemasters had achieved the respect they perhaps didn't always have in the early days. A good place where they were frighteningly consistent to a point that they maybe never quite got to again, even if they could and can still be counted on quite a lot of the time to deliver. They may not exactly be the same company nowadays as they were back in the 80s or 90s, but the Codemasters name has still endured, and in all probability it will continue to do so for a long time to come. A welcome link all the way back to the golden age of British microcomputers. Bye for now. When making videos about old companies, we often always look for originality. People who were trailblazers, unique software houses, folks like Matthew Smith or Belland Braben or Jeff Crammond, those who set out a stall entirely on their own. Normally if we look at something that's unoriginal, the story isn't necessarily a good one. We could look at someone like Harry Price, for example, a coder who made a career out of ripping off other games and then getting them released through various studios. The company today is kind of an odd one though. Were they a particularly original company? Well, no. Their games were quite similar to those of another more celebrated company, as was their style, their presentation. Hell, even their name was quite similar to that of one of the ZX Spectrum's most legendary companies, a name that everybody knows. And yet, Odin Computer Graphics are still thought of as a pretty good software house from the time, if nothing else then for the simple reason that they made some really bloody good games. They may have been heavily influenced by the trend-setting approaches made by a more famous and mysterious group of people based in Ashby-de-la-Zouch, but their games were still good enough to a point where, if you were a big fan of the sort of titles that Ultimate Play the Game produced, you would probably enjoy their games too. The likes of Nodes of Yesod and Robin of the Wood were excellent. They were good enough for Telecomsoft to sniff around and sign them up to a big exclusive deal that could have taken them to another level, but eventually resulted in their downfall. But they had a group of very talented coders, some intriguing games and, well, there's some wild stories to tell as a result of that. And so here's a look at another curious part of 80s microcomputer history, the story of Odin. Today's video is sponsored by Wireframe, the monthly magazine that doesn't just cover the latest games, but goes inside of them. It has features on great games, both old and new, many an enlightening piece on the history of games and their creators, and it also encourages people to get into the art of game development themselves, with articles on how to recreate famous games, mechanics, and features in engines such as Unreal in their unique Toolbox section. It comes complete with beautiful, glossy artwork and opinion pieces from various key people in the industry. Oh, and me. That's what you'll find, along with a whole lot more, every month in Wireframe Magazine, the magazine that lifts the lid on video games. To subscribe, visit wfmag.cc/KimJustice in the description, and I thank them for their support today. As it goes, this story starts with another Norse god entirely. Before Odin, there was Thor. This company started out in 1984 in an office in Cannon Place, close by the rather fertile surroundings of Liverpool's Albert Dock, home to the likes of Bugbite, Denton Designs and, most famously, Psygnosis a bit later on. Formed by a man named Paul McKenna, not the famous hypnotist, but instead a construction-based entrepreneur, the original aim of Thor was simply to be a studio that published games from freelancers who'd sent them in, much like many other startups from back in the day. You can almost see the adverts now. Are you tired of doing boring sums? Want to get away from a regular office job? Well, you could earn literal millions from releasing computer games. Just look at our star coder, 11-year-old Thorpe Dean Thomas. He sent a game in to us, we released it, and now he's just bought a fully working-to-scale replica of Thunderbird 2. What are you waiting for? Apply now! Okay, I'm sure their adverts weren't quite like that, but these were the days of the bedroom coder boom, and Imagine Software and all of that sort of thing. Now, were Thor a particularly successful studio? Nah, not really. Most, if not all of their games can pretty firmly be put in a pile marked not very good, although they did have a fairly minor trio of hits with the Jack and the Beanstalk trilogy in 1984, the original Jack and the Beanstalk, The House Jack Built, and Giant's Revenge. These are single-screen platform adventure type games and, well, they're frankly maddening to play, especially now. The first screen of Jack and the Beanstalk in particular is a truly detestable creation, with a tree that you fall off the second you put half a pixel on. But the games were successful, and they're not completely bad. The graphics are actually quite good, doing some pretty neat things when it comes to large creations and perspective. The 17-year-old fella behind the series, Chris Carey, would later go on to make plenty more games through the likes of Gremlin and Ocean Software. He would indeed almost be Thor's version of Eugene Evans, meriting a front-page article in Home Computing Weekly announcing that he was dropping his A-levels in order to freelance for Thor and potentially earn tens of thousands in royalties. As for the rest of their output, it's fair to say that they're not the games of the gods that their advertising would suggest. Most of them are pretty simple, really. Gremlins, for example, is another game by Chris Carey that's more in the regular Galaxian space shooter vein, although the graphics do get rather funky as you get further into each stage. It's not exactly a good effect, although it is certainly a ballsy one. Other games like Night Stalker fall into Centipede clone territory, and then you have Megafruit, which is a fruit machine. Not actually that bad a fruit machine game by 1984 basic standards, I suppose. Certainly better than the fruit machine on Don't Buy list, but still not much to speak of. Twilight Zone is probably my favourite of theirs. It's bloody hard, but it has a fairly neat idea of controlling two ships on a respective X and Y axis at the same time, and trying not to get either of them killed. Vicious and probably needs a bit more work, but I like the idea. In all honesty, I'd say that the Jack and the Beanstalk games are probably the ones that I like the least, simply because playing them can be so utterly annoying. It's hard enough to find the path through a stage, and then it's even harder to stick to that path and not put the slightest foot out of place. A lot of their games support the weird and wonderful Color microspeech too, although they don't necessarily get much out of them. It's not like Telecomsoft's breakthrough game Booty, where connecting a colour unlocked a whole new game. Something I forgot to mention in the first vid, so thanks for that, comments. Thor's time was pretty brief. The label only existed on its own in 1984 before things changed. Not that the company necessarily went out of business, it's just that Paul McKenna decided to switch things up a bit and instead of releasing cheapo games from bedroom coders, actually put an in-house team of more experienced and talented artists and coders together, presumably with the thought of releasing better games that merited the price point of a tenner, the one, funnily enough, that Ultimate had paved the way when it came to normalising. When he did this, he also decided to break away from the 4 name, which, well, hadn't exactly got the best reputation. Most of their games had come in for a bit of a kicking, particularly those Jack and the Beanstalk titles, which hadn't reviewed well at all, but had still managed to break the top 10, earning serious scorn from the likes of Crash and Sinclair User. And so, 4 exits the scene, to be replaced by Odin, or, more accurately, Odin Computer Graphics, often shortened to OCG. Part of the reason for this, according to artist Colin Grunes, was that Paul wanted Odin Computer Graphics to be confused with Ultimate's parent company name, Ashby Computers and Graphics, or ACG for short. Subtly sneaky, I'm sure you'll agree. The original Odin team consisted largely of folks who'd worked at places like Software Projects and Imagine, folks like Robbie and Keith Tinman, Stu Fotheringham, Colin Grunes, Mark Dawson, Steve Wetherill, Derek Rosen and a few others. It was always a small setup, after all it wasn't around long enough for it to really expand. A decent chunk of the core of this in-house team came in during the development of what was likely the last and certainly weirdest game released by 4 before Odin came along, a Commodore 64 game called Stairways. According to programmer Mark Dawson, now Wildin, from an old comment on a Polar Ventris video, shoutouts to Polar Ventris, this game is based on having an acid trip in a heavy metal nightclub called Stairways, and the nightclub itself did exist in real life. It was based in Birkenhead, close by the 4 Odin offices, was frequented by Dawson, Wetherill, Grunes and the rest of the staff on most evenings, and it was filled with beer users, raving drunks, bands and dancers. Just the sort of things our hero has to navigate in this odd and amusing little game that kind of bridges the gap a little bit between 4 and Odin, and gets us closer to the first game that was released under the new name, something that was going to be a hell of a lot different to the sort of software that 4 had become a bit infamous for. Nodes of Yesod. There were a couple of underpinning ideas behind Nodes of Yesod, with perhaps the most important one being that the game had to be a quite staggering looker, at least for 48K Spectrums circa 1985. The Odin team have never been particularly shy about mentioning their ultimate inspirations, so naturally Underworld is a pretty hefty inspiration behind this adventure platformer. However, the Odin team didn't necessarily see Ultimate's games as something to cheaply rip off. They saw them more as something to aspire to, a technical and gameplay standard that they wanted to achieve themselves, and if they were going to be compared to them, that would be taken as a compliment rather than a criticism. Work on the game's art and animation was meticulous, particularly that of the main man himself, Sir Charlemagne Fotheringham Grunes, normally known as Astro Charlie in-house, and taking his double-barreled surname from Stu Fotheringham and Colin Grunes, 2 of the game's artists. The beautifully detailed sprite, apparently derived from a knock-up that Grunes made of Big Ears for a Noddy-based licensed game that never came about, also moves smoothly and has a wonderful somersault jump. It's a truly magnificent creation indeed, and a lot of the other sprites and enemies have a similar level of quality behind them. Of course, the challenge with all this beautiful art was putting it together into a game and making it work in 48K. This challenge proved to be too much for the initial assigned programmer, and Steve Wetherill was brought in from Software Projects to be part of it. According to his interview with Craig Granell in Retro Gamer, it took all of one look at Charlie's animations for him to join up with Team Odin. The development of the game didn't necessarily go all the way smoothly. As was the case with a lot of games in those days, there wasn't a lot in the way of planning, and the details of what was actually going to happen in the game would more likely be rolling around in someone's head, as opposed to being documented. Steve Wetherill recalls that someone would ask what the gravity sticks, an item that causes monsters to fall to the floor temporarily, would do here, and someone would immediately pipe up with, "What's a gravity stick?" Making the game was all a bit rough and ready, but it did get there in the end. Another thing that didn't exactly help was that Odin initially used micro drives as storage while it was being worked on. You know, that famously reliable bit of kit. Needless to say, there was a big crash at one stage that wiped out a fair bit of data. One legend goes that there was actually a much better, almost completed version of Yesod that was lost forever due to this crash, although Steve doesn't recall that much being lost in Retro Gamer. It did kill a completed map layout, mind you. The team switched to BBC Model Bs for storage soon after, figuring out ways to download the data into Spectrum memory through CPM. For all of these various troubles, the game was eventually finished pretty much as Odin intended, and there was even room for a little bit of speech.
Welcome to the notes of Yesod from the Odin computer graphics team.
The introduction of Welcome to Nodes of Yesod from the Odin computer graphics team was provided by a certain Mark Butler, the same person who had once been at the head of the original Imagine software and who worked at Odin for a brief time. Finally, the game was out there in the summer of 1985 and, well, it was definitely worth all the trouble. Nodes of Yesod is a truly wonderful game, one of the best of a certain type of freeform platform adventure that you only really get on the microcomputers. Initially, you find lunar moles on the surface of the moon that will prove useful. One in particular will allow you to chew through certain bits of wall and uncover new areas. The main goal is to collect 8 keys, or alchems. You need to find out what colour and shape of alchem you need to get by finding the master alchem, and this changes with each playthrough. Once you have the right set, you can unlock the monolith that's somewhere inside the cavern and beat the game. Naturally, plenty of monsters will be fought in your progress. One set of monsters will hurt you on contact, but they can be squashed in traditional platformer fashion. Another set functions like the monsters in Ultimate's Underworld in that they don't hurt you directly, but they can knock you about, sending you flying down shafts and causing fall damage. Also, these ones cannot be squashed. The worst enemies are undoubtedly the Lunar Muggers, rival explorers who will steal your alchems if they come into contact with you, playing havoc with your game. So there's quite a lot of different things going on in this adventure, but even though the difficulty is certainly challenging, it does hold nicely together. Even if you don't complete the game, it's a nice world to explore, complete with those lovely specky colours and the in-game music, particularly in the later 1-8K version, a classic tune composed by Fred Gray. Nodes of Yesod was rightly a big hit, and it reviewed exceptionally well. The similarities to the sort of games that Ultimate would make were certainly noted in magazines like Crash, but that didn't stop the game from largely getting tremendous scores. Crash in particular were highly enthusiastic, giving it 93% and a full-on Crash smash. The game got some very good notices on other platforms too. Zap64 absolutely loved the fantastic Commodore version of the game, giving it 95%. Odin were very quickly established as a new name to be reckoned with thanks to the success and high quality of this debut title. And for me personally, well, I would actually rather play this over Ultimate's Underworld any day of the week. Sure, it's similar, but it just feels that much better, and the look of the game is so striking. It's a lovely little adventure, one that allows you to spend a good amount of time inside it, rather than straight away trying to kick you back out to the title screen as soon as you start it up. And it's still a game that can grab you and take you away for a bit without realising how much time you've spent playing it. It's hard to say a whole lot bad about it, in all honesty. Odin naturally struck quickly while the iron was hot. A sequel to Nodes of Yesod followed mere months later, The Ark of Yesod. Admittedly, there wasn't a huge amount different in this sequel, just a couple of new features, with Charlie now getting hold of a laser gun to deal with certain enemies, and walls that can potentially collapse at a moment's notice. Other than that, it's pretty much the same formula. This similarity was kind of recognised. Ark of Yesod was released at a slightly lower price point than Nodes of Yesod's tenner, and it actually came out through the rekindled 4 label, now known as 4 Computer Software, something that the studio would use for lower priced titles. Even if magazines didn't see it as a huge evolution in terms of sequels, it once again reviewed very well simply because they were happy to play more Nodes of Yesod. It's a fine enough game, although not as memorable as the first. There were plans, a couple of years after Odin's demise, for a proper 16-bit sequel called The Heart of Yesod, but unfortunately these never came close to fruition. Much later, in 2010, the Odin name was brought back by Paul McKenna and Steve Wetherill for the release of a 25th anniversary edition of Nodes of Yesod that was available on iOS, featuring new graphics, a good few quality of life improvements such as saving, and a choice between classic and enhanced modes. There is also an even newer 30th anniversary edition of the game, which can also be found for download on iOS, and Steve Wetherill is currently working on a version of the game for the ZX Spectrum next. In an ideal world, a brilliant game like Nodes of Yesod is followed up with nothing more than another brilliant game. Now that sort of thing doesn't always happen, but that's exactly what Odin managed to do with their next title, 1985's Robin of the Wood. It's another classic sort of microcomputer game, and another with some ties to Ultimate. If Nodes of Yesod was their take on Underworld, then Robin of the Wood is inspired by Sabrewulf, taking on the same sort of fast-paced maze adventure and once again delivering a high-quality product that could match its inspiration, and giving Odin another critical and commercial success. This game seems to be quite the collective effort, in much the same way as no one person was ever fully behind Nodes of Yesod, with the likes of Steve Wetherill, Paul Salmon and Stu Fotheringham all doing their bits here and there to get the game out, and the effort was most certainly worth it. Robin of the Wood naturally puts you in the shoes of that great English folk hero, Robin of Locksley, on his quest to win back the Silver Arrow in a grand tournament put on by the Sheriff of Nottingham. You escape from the dungeons, at least in the 128K version, and then travel around the forests of Sherwood and beyond, escaping from or defeating the various Norman soldiers that have been sent out to kill you, and trying to find enough gold bags to give to the Forest Ent, straight out of Tolkien, but hey-ho, we'll run with it, so that he'll give you your bow, your sword, and ultimately the 3 magic arrows that you need to enter the tournament in disguise and win back the arrow without being caught. There are some other potential distractions. Witches can randomly appear to take your gold as tribute, although they can also be appeased with magical plants. Wild boars can chase you off and can't be hurt, and other people can distract you and get you thrown back into the dungeon. Alternately, druids can heal your wounds, and there's plenty of regular arrows for your bow once you get it. In the end, it's a big old quest of finding stuff, similar to Sabrewulf and the pieces of the map, but quite a bit more detailed and involved. The main thing I enjoy about this game, particularly compared to a lot of other maze adventures of this type, is that Odin is very generous when it comes to how much time you can spend in the game. They're not so bound by arcade sensibility. Sabrewulf, brilliant game though it is, basically chucks everything at you from the beginning, and poor old Saberman dies in one hit no matter what, so it can be quite easy for you to die very quickly. Robin here actually has an energy bar which can be replenished, and it's pretty easy for him to amass extra lives for exploring. So you can happily spend a bunch of time in this world, even if you're not speeding towards the goal. And it's a nice world to spend time in. Much like Nodes of Yesod, the quality of the graphics here are very strong, good enough for the magazines of the time to be raving about it in much the same way. Robin especially is another strong sprite, and the game moves very smoothly indeed. There's nice music to go along with all of it too. It's another huge joy to play, deemed worthy of scores such as 94% from Crash and a 9 out of 10 from Your Sinclair. It got a pretty nice version on Commodore 64 as well, although an Amstrad CPC version didn't materialise. It was worked on by an external programmer, but progress didn't go as fast as Odin had hoped for, and by the time the Telecomsoft deal was in play, the company had too much on their plate to take the CPC version in-house. Bit of a shame. There is another little mystery when it comes to Robin of the Wood. There quite possibly could have been an arcade version of it. Just before the deal with Telecomsoft was struck, Odin were in talks with Capcom about doing some stuff together. It appears as though Capcom were interested in giving Odin the chance to do home computer ports of Gunsmoke in particular, and Odin fancied their chances at making an arcade version of Robin of the Wood. It's kind of funny in that the ultimate comparisons, again, are enhanced a bit further by this considering the Stamper's history in arcade games and producing the likes of Gyros for Konami. But it's kind of interesting to picture what a Robin of the Wood arcade game would have looked like. Presumably it would have been a fair bit different from the computer game. In any case, the deal didn't materialise, apparently because the deal with Telecomsoft was finalised a day earlier, thus stopping Odin from being able to do any work on a version of Gunsmoke or what have you. Again, a bit of a shame perhaps, if only because of curiosity. As with any small game studio in the 80s, mostly composed of young men, it's fair to say that the people at Odin did get up to some antics. There's a good few stories that have been told by the likes of Steve Wetherill and Stu Fotheringham over the years. One of the more famous ones is that one day an unnamed person put a sign in the window simply saying, "Fit birds apply within." And this apparently resulted in someone applying, getting into a relationship with one of the programmers, and eventually getting married. Others are, of course, a bit more debauched, vomiting into a disconnected sink after a hefty lunchtime session, an artist creating the loading screen for Robin of the Wood while smoking a jazz cigarette as long as a baby's arm, hiding under the desk from drunken louts trying to break into the office at the dead of night during the crunch period for nodes of Yesod, and another artist trying to call up demons in order to get one of the programmers. Just your standard fare, obviously. There wasn't really anyone at Odin with a defined role other than Paul McKenna being the managing director. He'd be in his own office and the rest of the staff would, well, they'd just get on with it without too much intrusion, pulling these games together as something of a collective and chaotic force. And initially, it did work. There were also the odd bits of experimentation that were a bit more connected with games. The Odin team had a big interest in Laserdisc games to the point that they'd purchased a Space Ace machine for the office, and they actually commissioned the tech person who'd designed the hardware that would have been used for Imagine's mega games, Cyclops and Bandersnatch, to see about creating an add-on for the Spectrum that would have seriously increased its RAM and colour palette, presumably with the intention of making Laserdisc-style games on the Spectrum. But this was soon deemed to be far too expensive. There was also a bit of playing around with Amigas. Paul McKenna was a fan of the platform, and a bunch of people at Odin were very enthusiastic too. A shame really then that Odin wouldn't survive long enough to make anything on the platform. As detailed in various Old Planet Sinclair interviews with the Odin team from 1997, they did make attempts at getting the movie licenses for both The Terminator and Dune, but neither of these came to fruition, and they did get a bit closer at getting a license for Raymond Briggs' animated movie, When the Wind Blows. Now Lord only knows what sort of game that would have been. A deal was very nearly completed, but Raymond Briggs had a change of heart at the last minute, declining to have a game made out of this light-hearted Armageddon-based hide-and-seek film, and offering up the chance to make a game from The Snowman instead. Odin passed on this, seeing as a game based on The Snowman had actually already been made. Another thing that's very much worth talking about when it comes to Odin is their advertising. Good lord, some of those posters and game covers are quite lush. Again, there was a bit of ultimate inspiration here. They had some rather stylised and out there cover art for their games, so naturally Odin did the same. But the covers for Nodes of Yesod, Robin of the Wood, and Heartland most definitely stand out, feeling like the sort of thing you'd see on a Psygnosis cover only a good while before that company existed. Nearly all of Odin's cover artwork was drawn by a local artist named Jerry Fisher, and it was quite inspired by the work of a still existing UK fine arts retailer by the name of Athena, who used to have a few stores on the high streets in the UK, but now largely operates online. Anyway, now we come to the pivotal moment for Odin, the big deal with Telecomsoft, who, like many, had had their heads turned by the studio's magnificent early games. This would be a big deal for the company. In the end, Paul McKenna convinced the interested party into agreeing a pretty nifty six-figure sum in exchange for 10 titles, delivered over the course of 1 year. If all had gone well, it would have certainly made everyone involved a decent bit of cash. Obviously Paul McKenna would have done well out of it, but hopefully everyone else would have done too. It was supposed to be the deal that would take Odin up even further, that would take them from new starlets in the British computer gaming world to an established name. But, well, it didn't work out that way, and this deal will be the thing that ends up killing the company entirely. We'll have more detail on that as we go through the rest of the Odin library, but it's time to move on to the first game that came out of the Odin Telecomsoft deal, and another quite major one, Heartland from 1986. Heartland, largely the design and creative work of Colin Grunes, but another Odin game that was quite the collaborative effort, was pretty much the game that on its own convinced Telecomsoft to go for the Odin deal. It absolutely promised to be another beautiful looking and well playing game from the studio, operating in a side-on view once again, but going for a slightly more traditional adventure platformer layout than the one you would find in Nodes of Yesod. As it goes, Heartland in its original Spectrum form does do some quite wonderful things. However, this time the gameplay perhaps doesn't quite match up to the presentation. That said, it's not a bad game at all. You play as a wizard named Bertie, apparently known as Bertie Big Boy inside the studio, and your job is to find and assemble the 6 pages of a magical book, while also destroying the 6 equivalent pages of a dark book that belong to a tyrant named Midan who rules the world. Obviously the 6 good pages will break his grip over the Heartland. Many enemies stand in your way, but you can kill them with the help of either your infinite magic hat or by throwing swords and fireballs that you can pick up. Other power-ups can also help you out by, say, making you invincible for a time, but not everything that flies around the screen is necessarily going to help you. And you've got to watch out. Bertie naturally gets weakened whenever he gets touched by an enemy, his health represented by the face of Midan getting clearer as he loses energy. If the face appears in full, the game is over. You only get 1 life. The technical qualities of Heartland become apparent when looking at the game's sprites and the very elaborate masking techniques that Steve Revel employed, something he describes as a mixture of and or coding techniques in an article on the game for Retrogamer. By way of example, look at how seamlessly the sprites mingle with each other in the game. Usually, when 2 sprites occupy the same space in a specky game, things can get pretty messy. Not so here. Notice how the enemy sprite moves smoothly behind Bertie with no interference whatsoever. That's down to the masking. Pretty nice as far as the specky goes, although doing this, and putting a whole lot of enemies and icons and so forth on screen, does cause the Spectrum to chug a bit, and this in turn gives the game one of its glaring issues. It's a beautiful title, but it can move quite slowly, which is a disappointment considering how smooth and silky both Yesod and Robin were. In the end, that's a function of just how bigger each sprite has to be in order to facilitate that masking. The game packs a lot into a single 48K load, but it still only has 48K to play with. Still, it's not a bad game. It's definitely worth a look if you can get past the rather cumbersome controls, and it's still garnered excellent scores from the mags, a 92% from Crash, 9 out of 10 from Your Sinclair, and a perfect 5 out of 5 from Sinclair User. It perhaps wasn't quite as big of a hit as something like Yesod was, but it still attracted a good bit of attention. I would say that if you're going to play the game today, you are best off playing the Amstrad CPC version. It still looks very nice graphically, but it actually moves a great deal faster than the Specky version, making it much more playable. You do still have to deal with some of the game design's more annoying foibles, in particular the gaps positioned at the end of certain screens that look like a path to the next screen, but are not. But it is worth it for the looks and the technical know-how behind it. It's perhaps unfortunate also that it is one of the last really strong games that Odin would produce, as the ramifications of the deal they made with Telecomsoft started to bite very hard indeed. Not long after securing the deal with Telecomsoft, Odin made a little move across Cannon Place to another, slightly larger set of offices that had previously been occupied by Bugbite. Not a huge relocation, considering that they could still see their old offices out the window, but the move was necessary to fit in a few more members of staff, people that the company would absolutely need if they had any hope of fulfilling their contract to produce 10 games in a year. Once the money signs had faded, it kind of became clear rather quickly just how much work that was going to entail. Would it be in any way possible to maintain the high standard that Odin had set up with their first set of games, the 2 Yesod titles, Robin of the Wood and Heartland? Ideally, in a story, this is the time when I tell you of the miracle that allowed them to work all the hours they possibly could and somehow pull that off. But unfortunately, well, the realistic and simple answer is no. In 1986 and 1987, the quality of Odin's games started to fall off a cliff thanks to this deal. The last set of Odin games can be put into 2 small groups, ones that still came out on the Odin name, and others that were released through 4, which was still kicking around. And unfortunately, almost all are bad. However, let's at least start with a game that does show a fair bit of quality about it, because they do deserve that. Sidewise is the last game that Steve Wetherill worked on under the Odin name, alongside Colin Grooms on the art, and it's quite the nice feat on the ZX Spectrum, at least technically. Steve's goal here was to produce a shoot 'em up on the Speccy that moved as smooth and as fast as something like Delta on the Commodore 64. In other words, a consistent 50 FPS. As Steve puts it, the game is chasing the raster of a CRT, catching up with it but not crossing it, which could cause interference. There's a lot of technical know-how going on here, but Steve managed to pull it off. Sidewise one's at an utterly smooth 50 FPS, with no flicker to be found. Technically, it is absolutely brilliant. Pulling this off while also dealing with backgrounds and sprites, even having parts where it feels like parallax is going on. Seriously impressive for the Spectrum, even now. Helpfully for those who are interested in details of the game's inner workings, Steve Wetherill has a few rather interesting articles on the creation of Sidewise on his blog. On the gameplay front, Sidewise is okay. It doesn't play too badly as far as shooters go, but it is grossly unfairly hard. Completing stages in the game is kind of a task of pure memory. It's not so much the enemies themselves, but the massive walls that suddenly fly at you in a split second with no warning that will almost certainly kill you. Savage stuff indeed, and that can be quite irritating. It's certainly worth playing to look at that technical quality and the game doing things that a lot of people didn't think the Speccy was capable of, but there are better shooters. The game was followed up in 1988 by Crosswise, a sequel that didn't come out under the Odin name, but was still made by Wetherill and Grooms. It's often thought of as an Odin game in all but name. This one isn't 50 FPS, but it's still doing a lot of impressive and colourful stuff. However, if anything, the game's even harder than Sidewise, and that's saying something. I'm not sure if I've played many shooters that are quite as uncompromising as Crosswise on the Speccy, and it doesn't necessarily make for an enjoyable experience, technically brilliant though the game might be. Still, these games are so far ahead of the rest of Odin's output in their later years that it isn't even funny. Most would be shocked at the majority of games that Odin produced in the Telecomsoft deal. There's such a far cry from the likes of Nodes of Yesod and Robin of the Wood that it may as well have been a completely different studio. The odd game has potential, like Hyperball, a future sports game made by Doug Burns, or Bernie Duggs as he usually styled himself. The actual playing of the game is quite smooth, nothing wrong with the controls or anything, but the aim of it all can be quite confusing. I believe you have to hit the little flying disc at the bottom of the middle bit, and then throw the ball into the moving hole that's on your side. I think. Honestly, I'm still not quite sure. The game does play fast and furiously, but yeah, it does kind of descend into aimless throwing around of the ball, I'm afraid. It could have done with being a little bit simpler. Still, it's nice to see that Doug gave a little cameo for his good friend Joffa Smith in the game. He is one of the playable strikers. Doug Burns also worked on a game called Plod for Odin, and apparently Joffa helped Doug out a bit on the graphics, but very little is known about the game aside from it being a scrolling shooter of some sort. It was never released. ICUPS, which apparently stands for International Commission for Universal Problem Solving, is a game released by Fall that's in two parts, the first being a very bare and irritating space shooter take on Spy Hunter. At least that's what it feels like. If you somehow get past this part, seeing as it throws ships endlessly at you and half of which you can't even bloody kill, you get chucked into a mazy shooter where your bug hero flies about a bit, and it's really quite slow. Definitely not something to bother with at all, I'm afraid. Throwing it over to the Commodore, Mission AD is another one that has a bit of potential but just doesn't quite stick the landing. It's a xenophobe type game where the aim is to hunt and kill assassins, as shown in the picture on the display. Graphically and sonically it's fine, but the actual playing of the game can just be a little bit aimless. It's a lot better than Scary Monsters, mind you. I mean, God, this is awful. There's a map that you can hardly get around, and various levels to enter where you battle the most generic scary things known to man in search of the weapons needed to kill the more famous beasts. Graphically not very impressive, and the controls are sluggish as hell. You'll spend half your time getting battered around the map the second you get hit by one of the ghosts or bats or vampires or whatever that constantly rush you. Dreadful game. It only gets worse, really. UFO is something that just feels a bit like old hat. It's like Space Invaders or Galaxian or whatever, only you can move about a bit more and you have a shield if you want. I suppose this is a budget game, available at the low cost of $1.99, so there should be a bit more forgiveness here. It's no worse or better than the average budget game that was released under the Silverbird label, but again it does feel a little beneath Odin. But then, ugh. We get to On the Tiles. This one's the nadir, I'm afraid. You play as a cat and you have to collect fish bones in order to take over your territory. Collect enough and you move on to the next one. This could have been good. It's not bad graphically and the animation on the cat is fine. But the controls are grotesque. So slow it feels like you're mailing your button pressers in. Enemies don't have the same problem. They just rush you, giving you no time to react. And even if you do pounce on them, it's a toss-up as to whether the game just kills you anyway, and even the 9 lives you have at the start probably aren't going to last all that long. Unfortunately, it just ends up being a disaster, the sort of half-baked and poorly executed title that summed things up for Odin during the crunch of the Telecomsoft deal. Finally, it all ended in 1988 with The Plot, otherwise known as Gunpowder. A not actually that dreadful but still disappointing micro-style platformer where you play as Guy Fawkes on the search for fireworks. It's not awful, but there's so many other better games in this style that this one's just not particularly worth giving much attention to. Simple as that. So, what happened exactly? Why did the Telecomsoft deal essentially wreck Odin and saw them go from producing some of the most impressive micro games around to producing such relative garbage? There's a good few reasons, really, both on the Odin side and on the Telecom side. To go to the Telecom side first, well, it's a pretty harsh deal, isn't it? Telecomsoft made a deal for the studio to produce 10 games inside of a year, and that's one thing. But it's not like they just wanted any old games. They wanted 10 games that were of the same quality as the likes of Nodes of Yesod and Robin of the Wood. And sure, while that would be ideal, that would be pretty bloody hard if not impossible for literally anyone to do, no matter how talented, let alone a small studio like Odin. One wonders if it would have been better to have a few less games involved as part of the deal. Of course it absolutely would have been, but that would have perhaps involved a bit less money. On the Odin side, the company was far too small and far too inexperienced to truly fulfill a deal like this one. The original Odin games were created by a largely teenage team who weren't exactly into planning and organisation. The big ideas were there, but the details and intricacies were usually worked out on the fly and iterated on. And this worked. They flew by the seat of their pants, they all pulled together and produced great stuff. But the Telecomsoft deal changed everything. It's not just the question of having to hire a bunch of new people and those people fitting in, it's that now Odin had to split into multiple teams working on multiple projects, all sorts of crossing over and what have you. It didn't take long for the whole thing to become a disorganised mess. As retold by the likes of Weatherall and Fotheringham, the whole atmosphere at the studio changed. It used to be a fun and positive environment, but with the teams in a state of perpetual mega crunch, it turned into a rather negative and argumentative one. As a result of this, people gradually packed their bags and started to leave. By the time the Telecomsoft deal was over, a big chunk of Odin's staff had gone. And then, to top it all off, there was the big dispute between Paul McKenna and Telecomsoft as to whether the contract had actually been fulfilled at the end of the day. There were a couple of unreleased games, ones that Telecomsoft didn't accept. A tank game of sorts, a gladiator-style fighting game, and a game called Lusitania where you had to explore a sunken ship, of which a couple of screenshots for the Amstrad CPC exist. When all was said and done, Paul McKenna said that the studio had produced the agreed upon amount of titles, and Telecomsoft disputed that entirely, refusing to pay for several of them. For Odin, this lack of payment would spell the end of the company. Telecomsoft might not have ended up with 10 Robin of the Woods, but in holding out on the money, Odin was finished. Almost as soon as the contract between the company and Telecomsoft came to its messy end, the company folded. What happened over the next, ever? The majority of the staff would go on to work at Denton Designs for a while, before gradually flying off to various other places in and out of the industry. Steve Weatherall and Colin Grunes continued on together for a good while, forming a small studio that lasted for a couple of years called, wonderfully, Eldritch the Cat. These folks, named after Steve's cat, who so happened to be named after the lead singer of Sisters of Mercy, would have produced the previously mentioned Heart of Yesod title, if it had happened. Eventually, Steve went on to work for Electronic Arts in the 90s, while Stu Fotheringham also worked together with Colin for a good length of time in consultancy. Of all the former Odin employees, Steve Weatherall is surely the most celebrated of them all. At Electronic Arts he worked as a producer on games including the original Desert Strike, and from there, most famously, he would be a producer and technical director at Westwood for Command & Conquer, including Red Alert 1 and 2, and Tiberian Sun. Not bad, it must be said. As for the boss, Paul McKenna, well, he was somewhat more enigmatic, going back to construction. Something of a stink did arise back in 2005 on newsgroups and forums when he had Odin's games pulled from the popular website World of Spectrum, but not much else was heard until he revived the Odin name in 2010 for the anniversary of Nodes of Yesod, getting back in touch with Steve Weatherall for the production of it. Finally, if you want one other odd little fact to end the video, Odin's offices in Canning Place had a decent chunk of warehouse space attached to it. Indeed, the whole of the offices would end up being used as a warehouse for Telecomsoft when the company met its demise. The manager of this warehouse was a young man by the name of Neil Fitzmaurice. If that name's familiar, it's because he went on to become an actor, starring and writing in all sorts of comedies, the likes of Benidorm and Phoenix Nights, but he is probably most famous for the role of Jeff in Peep Show. So, there you go. And so that, in a nutshell, is the story of Odin. It's kind of an unfortunate story in the end. They started out pretty low on the totem pole, and even if they were inspired quite heavily by the workings of a truly great company, I think of the quasi-relationship between Odin and Ultimate as similar to the one between a master and a pupil. They learned a lot from how a company like Ultimate did business, and used that to make brilliant games that stood out on their own. They amassed a lot of potential in a short space of time, but unfortunately they were fatally wounded by a deal that stretched them way too far, way too soon. While it's impossible to predict an alternate future in its entirety, well, if it wasn't for that deal, the company may well have lasted a lot longer, and we'd have seen those Odin Amiga games, and what the group could have still done as a unit, although a lot of the people involved with the company would go on to solid industry careers that continue to this day. Even if they weren't around for too long, they certainly made a mark. Join me soon for the next instalment of the Telecomsoft universe, where we'll be looking at Magnetic Scrolls and Level 9. It's text adventure time, and a bunch of Brits are going to try and beat those folks across the pond at their own game. But until then, as ever, bye for now. We've looked at Telecomsoft themselves, we've done Odin, and now, in the third instalment of the Telecomsoft universe, it's time to strip everything down and visit a genre of games that, for a few years, certainly had its time in the sun. There'll be no platforming here, or much in the way of arcade sensibilities, because we're going to visit the realm of the text adventure. And we're looking specifically at a British company that tried to beat the most popular and most advanced creators of these stories from across the pond at their own game. And hell, they were definitely right up there with them at times. Magnetic Scrolls wanted to achieve as much as possible when it came to these journeys that you'd navigate with the help of a text parser. While text adventures were quite popular indeed in the UK, Magnetic Scrolls looked beyond the often more limited games that were successful on these shores and towards America, particularly the work of Infocom, for their measuring stick on just what made a successful text-based game. They paired up with Telecomsoft, specifically Rainbird, in order to bring their works to as many people as possible. They did quite a lot of pioneering and technically excellent things in their time, and they also had something unique and kind of groundbreaking in these times. A charismatic and very outspoken leader by the name of Anita Sinclair, one of the few women bosses of a game studio in what was generally quite the male-dominated world. Even as the inexorable movement of progress gradually limited their audience, Magnetic Scrolls would carry on defiantly until it wasn't possible to do so anymore, and their story is definitely worth telling. And so, here it is, the story of Magnetic Scrolls. Get comfy. Before we really kick into the realm of Magnetic Scrolls, a bit of context is required when it comes to text adventures, and how successful they were here in the UK on the popular microcomputers. Now, for most people, the first name that springs to mind when it comes to text adventures is Infocom. These folks are, of course, the undisputed masters of the field. Their games are legendary, the freedom granted by their text parsers was quite something for games like this, and in the days before adventure games got more graphic, they were huge. In America, anyway. The success of Infocom doesn't factor a great deal in this story as far as the UK goes, because for quite a long time we simply didn't have their games on the shelves. Infocom games didn't officially come to the United Kingdom until 1986, after the company had been bought by Activision, and kind of after the company's glory days. Infocom will certainly have a part to play in this story, but the average person didn't know them from Adam. So what did we have? While all the 8-bit micros had their fair share of text adventures, it's fair to say that if you were a fan of the genre over here, you would likely be playing most adventures on the Spectrum, where hundreds if not thousands of these games were released. The first major one of note for a lot of people, on the Specky anyway, would be Melbourne House's The Hobbit. It was originally released there and then ported everywhere. The game was certainly a big hit. It's got graphics to go along with the text parser, one that was quite advanced for the Spectrum at the time, although, well, if you were to compare this to an average game that Infocom was releasing at the time, you would undoubtedly find this one to be wanting. Still, it is an important game, especially in regards to establishing the ZX Spectrum as a popular platform for the text adventure. It certainly wouldn't take too long for companies to form that would try and push boundaries with the genre, or would specialise purely in text adventures. A company called Legend in 1983 turned a hell of a lot of heads with a text and graphic adventure hybrid called Valhalla, a very popular and high-class game, and a studio that showed a lot of promise. Well, until they followed it up with the Great Space Race anyway. Other games were less complex, but still popular. A lot of people are fond of Urban Upstart, an altogether cruder but more comedic adventure from 1983 that's a bit different to the bulk of the popular text adventure games that tended to be biased towards fantasy or science fiction. But before Magnetic Scrolls, the main studio that really excelled was a group called Level 9, who we'll also be looking at a little bit in this video due to their own Telecomsoft connection. This family-run studio from the West Country were the undisputed champions of the text adventure in the first half of the decade. Level 9's games were much more advanced than most of the other titles on British shelves. They had their own very polished parser that was just about on par with Infocom's, and perhaps even more impressive due to it having to be loaded in one go on cassette tape media, and they had the storytelling chops to match their outstanding technical capability. Their first trilogy of games in 1982 for the BBC Micro, Colossal Adventure, Adventure Quest and Dungeon Adventure, usually known as the Middle-earth trilogy due to their huge influence from good old Tolkien, turned a hell of a lot of heads, and this would continue with the likes of Lords of Time, Red Moon and Return to Eden. We'll come back a bit to these folks later. Quite possibly more important than any of this though, when it comes to the ubiquity and popularity of the text adventure on the Micros, is something that's not a game. It's a piece of software released in late 1983 called The Quill. The Quill was created by a man named Graham Yendall, and it allowed people to create text adventures entirely of their own. There'd be no graphics available as there were in The Hobbit or other commercial games, and the text parser certainly wouldn't be as capable, but still, the tools are here for you to write your own story. And that's exactly what people did. In 1984, The Quill was successful beyond even the wildest of expectations. Many people bought it, and studios even ended up using it. Hundreds of commercially released games, including some quite popular ones, were created entirely using The Quill. Much like The Hobbit, it wasn't too long before you'd find The Quill on every other micro platform, and more advanced versions of the software would be released in later years. With the aid of The Quill, plenty more text adventures would make their way into the market. It ensured that absolutely every magazine would require a whole chunk of their copy to be dedicated entirely to the latest titles. As with any piece of software like this, some games made with The Quill were excellent, while some were, well, not so excellent. The creator most certainly had its limitations, particularly in its original form, but that doesn't stop certain people from weaving magic with it. But of course, it's not the be-all and end-all. There'll still be those who want to create a parser and make something more complex. So with this in mind, let's introduce three teenagers. Ken Gordon, Hugh Steers and Rob Steggles. Adventure nuts, D&D enthusiasts, you name it. The year is 1983, Ken and Hugh also had a talent for coding to go along with the love of their adventure games, and Ken also had access to an Apple II at home. Now, even if Infocom games weren't commercially available over here yet, there would be a few people who were definitely aware of them, and even if the market for a computer like the Apple II was pretty frickin' small, it allowed those people to seek out and import games like Planetfall, like Hitchhiker's Guide, like the Zork series and so on. And of course, this trio absolutely loved these games, far more than the sort of thing you would generally be able to get on the UK micros. More than that, they wanted to make games just like these ones. And before too long, another person would enter the fray who would help to make this dream a reality. This particular person would be another friend of Ken Gordon's, and her name was Anita Sinclair. A couple of years older than Ken and the others, but still only 18 herself. When they got together, they all hit it off pretty quickly due to their shared love of adventures and programming. It should be said immediately that although you're probably thinking she's related to a certain Sir Clive, that was not the case. She probably had to say no relation a lot herself, especially seeing as she worked at Sinclair Research and was, in fact, Sir Clive Sinclair's PA. But before any of that, Anita Sinclair was a woman from a quite well-off background, but rather than doing the more upper-class things that were necessarily expected of her, she became enamoured with electronics, computers and programming from a young age, spending most of her teenage years hanging around computer shops and fiddling with 6502s. Anita would go on to pretty much be the head of the group that took form, and certainly one of the most visible software house bosses around during the 1980s. Now, of course, a big part of this was the anomaly side of things. While there were certainly plenty of women working in the UK industry, from great artists like Karen Davies, Ali Noble and Dawn Drake, to folks who were more in the background like US Golden Centresoft's Anne Brown, there really weren't a whole lot in the vocal boss position, heading up the company, as well as being entirely involved in the creative and the design process. A few came along later in the decade: Jane Kavanagh at Sales Curve, Paula Byrne taking over at Telecomsoft, Vicky Khan at fellow text aficionados Mosaic Publishing, Ali Noble, once again, in the later stages of Denton Designs. But Anita was certainly one of the first, complete with the talent and charisma to put herself out there that went beyond the novelty of magazines going, "Ooh, look, here's a lady in the industry. Well, those sisters are well and truly doing it for themselves," and so on. Although, there would be plenty of that. We'll get into this a bit more later. The origin of magnetic scrolls happened during one particular late-night meeting in 1983 between Anita, Ken and Hugh Steers, another trio of youngsters getting out there, and this particular one deciding that they wanted to get in there and make those text adventures, inspired by the work of Infocom. They'd already started work on a proper bespoke parser and so forth. Anita initially thought that taking a more traditional path and doing arcade-style games might be a better idea, but she soon came around to the other pair's way of thinking, and the trio would start to set about acquiring the necessary funds to kickstart this venture, not just from familial wealth, but also from various odd jobs, including, apparently, a few unattributed arcade games that Anita Sinclair had written on freelance gigs. They also created something of a proof of concept, a bit of a legend that's never seen the light of day, a rather lewd text adventure called The Willy Affair, which according to Mark Hardesty in his Classic Adventurer interview with Anita from 2018, got its name from her habit of saying, "Can you pass me the Willy?" if she needed something but couldn't think of the word that she wanted to use. Excellent native coder's wit. Now you might wonder as well about the third man in the original trio from the first chapter, Rob Steggles. Well, he wasn't particularly interested in being at the head of this company, being quite the untechnical person. However, when it came to devising their first proper game, it wasn't too long before the Magnetic Scrolls trio thought of their friend and his great skill as a dungeon master in D&D games when it came to devising up scenarios for people to play through. So they got together with Rob, put him in the company as well, devised up a whole load of ideas, and Rob then spent the next few weeks taking those ideas and putting them together into a story. And then the small group pretty much spent a whole year working on making this story into a game. This is the beginnings of what would eventually become Magnetic Scrolls' debut title, The Pawn. So in the most simple terms, how was something like The Pawn going to differ from a more basic text adventure? Perhaps the best way to think of it would be to see how many commands you would be able to string into that parser in one line before it just collapses and says, "Sorry, I don't understand." Most text adventures written inside of the quill didn't go too far beyond what was usually known as verb-noun. For example, go south, open door, get key, and so on. When a parser is quite limited in this way, text adventures tend to run into a problem that designers call guess the verb. The player knows exactly what they want to do, but they need to spend a lot of time trying to find the exact combination of words that the parser is looking for so they can do it, because there's no variation. Now if you're an impatient so-and-so like me, that's usually the point swear words start getting poured relentlessly into the parser and the game gets turned off. In straightforward game design terms, the more commands that a parser can take and interpret, the longer and more varied a sentence the player can put in, they don't have to guess the verb, and they're more immersed in the experience. And even if this is all text, creating a parser that can handle so many variable strings of commands is a lot of work indeed, hence why the development of something like The Pawn took a whole year. All of the big names in the adventure world, the level 9s and the infocoms, had their own complex parsers that were guarded pretty closely, and Magnetic Scrolls worked from scratch to build their own, although what they eventually built for the pawn is something that would keep, with the odd bit of tinkering and upgrading, for most of the rest of their adventure titles going forward. This parser would be given the codename of Eltham, named after the location of their original office in southeast London. There were a few little tricks that the Magnetic Scrolls team were fond of demonstrating when it came to the pawn's parser, things that would draw gasps from the assembled journos. One particular one that they enjoyed was, use the trowel to plant the pot plant in the plant pot. This tongue-twisting volley of commands is hard enough to say, let alone interpret, but the parser was able to handle it with no issue. Another one they liked was, tie the hoe and the rake together with the shirt, usually then followed by, lever the boulder with the rake and the hoe. And yes, these are solutions to puzzles in the game, and you may already wonder how the hell anyone would think of such things without using some sort of guide, but still, it's a pretty good string for a parser to take on. Now, it's certainly not perfect in this form. The pawn does like to use these fancy strings, and in the cases they're employed you do still kinda have to get them exactly right, otherwise the parser will misinterpret them in ways that can screw up your game far more than a simple "I don't understand the word arse" can. It's not so much guess the verb as it is guess the verbiage, and when it's combined with some of the moon logic that the puzzles in the game use, it can still get rather annoying. The magnificent Jimmy Mayer, over at the Digital Antiquarian blog, has some very good examples of how the parser in the pawn can go wrong, and how it can still frustrate the player to no end, and his writing on the pawn and many other text adventures is, for me, essential reading. Link in the description. The pawn is very good for a first attempt, but it's not quite at the level of Infocom yet. It will get better over time, mind you. Now, I've actually talked quite a lot already about the pawn's technical prowess, but I've barely even mentioned just what the game actually frickin' is, and how successful it was. So, perhaps we should do that. In the pawn, you play as a hippie, as evidenced by the plant design on your shirt, who suddenly wakes up one day in the magical kingdom of Kirovnia, with a wristband that you can't remove. There's about to be an election in this kingdom, and you, basically as the titular pawn, are going to be pushed and pulled in various directions in order to influence this democratic process in the way that the candidates want. Various things will happen in this process. You'll be relentlessly mocked and possibly murdered by a guru, kicked out of the palace by a kin for no reason at all, you'll kill someone for reasons that are questionable at best, you'll meet a horse that talks exactly like the famous TV character Mr. Ed, and you might even run into the programmers of this very game just as they're about to make their way to the pub. So yeah, the pawn isn't exactly the most po-faced of adventure games. Quite a lot of it is parody, with send-ups of various bad adventure game tropes and clichés all over the shop. A particular one that I enjoy is the endless maze that you find on your travels. If you go in, you will be utterly stuck, every direction available to you no matter what, in an utterly featureless labyrinth. But don't worry too much, simply enter exit maze, and you'll automatically leave. Things like that are still quite funny. And of course there is some of the rather silly solutions to puzzles kicking around, or the almost hilariously arbitrary you must drop everything conditions that the game occasionally sets for you, basically functioning as traps because, generally speaking, you will immediately break any item that you drop and most of them are essential. It's not a particularly kind game when it comes to the poor hero, it has to be said, but that quality can be rather funny from time to time. The pawn had a long old journey to prominence. It would take more than one version for the game to get there. While we've been using the more famous 16-bit Amiga version to show the game off so far, the pawn was actually first released on, of all platforms, Sir Clive Sinclair's glorious Quantum Leap. Yep, it's the Sinclair QL. For the utterly nascent Magnetic Scrolls, it made sense to give this a go. Anita Sinclair had that Sir Clive connection, seeing as the two were firm friends as well as former work colleagues, and the new QL was kind of struggling to attract anybody to the platform, seeing as people didn't have much of an idea whether it was a business computer or a recreational computer or, well, anything at all. Aside from abortive attempts at bringing that old mega game Bandersnatch to the platform, not a lot was happening, and so Magnetic Scrolls stepped in with this, the original version of the Pawn in 1985, one of the few games to be released on the platform through Sinclair's own label in its commercial lifespan, and normally known as QL Pawn to differentiate it from the better versions to come. Obviously, it didn't do very well, because it was on the Sinclair QL, and the big difference here between this and other versions is that there's nothing here but text. However, the Pawn did at least cause enough of a stir on the QL for people to be curious about the game, and for some folks to see about taking it away and porting it from, well, let's face it, this rather lame duck of a platform, particularly when it came to games of any kind. The Pawn may not have done all that well on the QL, but that was far from the end of the story. With Magnetic Scrolls now more established and finding new officers on Borough High Street in South London, it was time to think up the next move, seeing as they now had a release under their belt. But they weren't quite done with the Pawn yet. This was, after all, a time of transition. It's 1985, the 16-bit micros like the Atari ST and the Amiga are starting to get out there, and there had been enough good words said about Magnetic Scrolls' first adventure, even on a quite small platform, for them to think that the game had enough legs to get on another platform, ideally something like the Amiga or the Atari ST. And here's where the Telecomsoft connection comes in. Thanks to a hookup from Argonaut's Jez San, the studio got in touch with Rainbird, the wing of the company that tended to deal more with adventures and other less action-based titles, with the proposal of releasing an enhanced version of the game for the ST. Things went pretty well, seeing as Anita Sinclair and Tony Rainbird clicked together pretty quickly. While Anita again initially thought of retreating towards more arcade-friendly games, Tony didn't have a lot of interest in any of that, and instead paid a lot more attention to the adventure game that they'd already released on the QL. Thanks to the Pawn, a deal was agreed that would end up giving Magnetic Scrolls a publisher for most of their lifespan. As far as upgrading the game goes, the very simple suggestion was that the game needed some artwork. It would be a whole lot better if there were some pretty pictures to go along with the nicely written text, wouldn't it? An artist named Jeff Quilley was assigned to do exactly that, creating the pictures that would set the scene and give the game a whole lot more style, creating bitmap artwork that was something wholly different to the sort of line-based art that you would see accompanying 8-bit microtext adventures. This 16-bit version of the Pawn also presents the Elton parser in a form that's probably familiar to most. The main bit of the screen is obviously dedicated to the adventure itself, but there's a menu up top. You've got your basic save, load and restart options of course, but there's some other things here. You can change how much text actually comes up, for example, whether the game's text is normal, brief or verbose. You've got quick commands to see a hint or have a look at where the exits are. There's also other options here that do make the game more accessible. You can change the size of the text to make it larger, and you can also turn speech on and off. Now obviously this is only the Amiga's computer voice, but that's still cool if you're unable to see the text yourself.
Grassy plain. This is an extensive area of grassy plain. Looking westward you can recognize the gravel path.
And as for those lovely bits of art, well, to see those you simply drag the top bar down with the right mouse button and they'll appear right in front of your eyes. Not bad, eh? Get used to this interface, because it's what you'll be seeing for most of Magnetic Scrolls games. So did the Pawn have legs on the new 16-bit micros? I think you know the answer to that. Yes, it absolutely did. It was released initially on the Atari ST, although, like a lot of Rainbird titles, it was perhaps more famous and successful on the Amiga. It also comes with a new and altogether more luxurious package. Gone is the Spartan cover of the original QL Pawn, here's wonderful box art and lots of goodies inside the box, a map of the world of Kurovnia, an extensive manual, and even a novella called A Tale of Kurovnia, written by Georgina Sinclair, Anita's sister. In this form, the game was the massive success that it absolutely deserved to be, and the beautiful art from Jeff Quilley was a big selling point indeed, not just for the game, but for the computers themselves. Much like Jim Sack's famous art in Defender of the Crown, this sort of quality is not something that you're ever going to be able to get on most of the 8-bit micros, although the eventual port of the game to the Commodore 64 would do the very best it could to convert that. Also significantly, the pawn would break into North America, getting rave reviews, a whole lot of sales, and providing a text adventure that critics would consider to be on par with those of Infocoms. Suddenly Magnetic Scrolls and Rainbird are over there in 1986, waving those big old "the British are coming" flags around, and the great success of the pawn meant that there would always be some interest stateside in whatever the studio were doing. Now, Rainbird's big tilt towards the text adventure wouldn't just include Magnetic Scrolls. They made an agreement at around the same time with Level 9. This agreement, by and large, would centre around upgrading some of their classic old adventures for the 16-bit micros, in a similar fashion to what had happened with the pawn. The legendary original trio of Colossal Adventure, Adventure Quest and Dungeon Adventure, previously known as the Middle-earth trilogy, would be given a glow-up in 1986, although a lot of the more direct Tolkien references were removed. As a result, the trilogy was given the new name of Jewels of Darkness. Also in 1986, a more science fiction based trilogy of games, Snowball, Return to Eden and The Worm in Paradise, would also be compiled into a single box release named Silicone Dreams, giving the games a new lease of life and, again, like a lot of Rainbird's titles, trying to break North America further with these classic British text adventures. As for Magnetic Scrolls, they were busy working on their next, all-new adventure. With the pawn finally reaching a satisfying conclusion, the team decided to stay in the fantasy land of Coovnia for their next title, 1987's The Guild of Thieves. Rob Steggles would once again be the man to devise the story for the game, and Jeff Quilley would once again be providing those lovely graphics. The Guild of Thieves is a more straightforward and to-the-point game than the pawn. As the title suggests, you're aiming to become a fully fledged member of the Thieves Guild, and your mission is to sneak yourself into a mansion and nick anything inside that might be valuable. Once again, the box contains a whole load of goodies. An account card for the Bank of Coovnia, a What Burglar newsletter, and a contract for the Thieves Guild, amongst the usual nice manual and obviously essential discs. Naturally, these trinkets might also prove to be pretty useful in the game themselves, acting as a rather fancy sort of copy protection. The game itself doesn't change much when it comes to interface. It's the same as the pawn, and the artwork is still very nice indeed, both here and once again on the 8-bit version for the C64, which does a damn fine job of replicating the art despite the limitations, thanks to Tristan Humphreys. As far as text adventures go, the Guild of Thieves is a damn fine one. It feels like a real classic of the genre, fast-paced and with puzzles and logic that tends to make a lot more sense than the ones in the pawn. It's also here where the parser shows a lot more of its actual strengths, as opposed to the parlour tricks that it performed in the pawn. Now, I'm admittedly not the greatest player of these games, and I can find the text cumbersome, so it's very nice to be able to simply put in "take all" and put in case when confronted with a whole lot of items, or alternately, drop all items except X when I need to dump a bunch of them somewhere but leave a couple of others. That sort of thing is a huge quality of life improvement. The Guild of Thieves doesn't necessarily feature the same level of wit, or indeed cruelty, as the pawn, but it's a very sleek title, good enough to win a Golden Joystick Award for Best Adventure Game in 1987. Magnetic Scrolls had been around for a good couple of years now, and they had 2 main games under their belt. The Guild of Thieves was another successful title, although not quite as successful as the all-conquering pawn. The combination of Magnetic Scrolls and Rainbird, especially with Tony Rainbird in charge, proved very fruitful. Mind you, this would change a bit at the end of 1986, when Tony Rainbird decided to leave his namesake company. This was a bit of a blow for Magnetic Scrolls and Anita Sinclair. She had always got on very well with Tony, and his own love of adventures had definitely helped, but she didn't get on nearly as well with Paula Byrne, Tony's replacement, meaning things certainly got a bit more fractious between developer and publisher going forward. Indeed, it got to a point where Paula Byrne, in the press, made no secret of the fact that her and Anita Sinclair just didn't get on at all. It probably didn't help too much that the former boss of Rainbird could now be found at Magnetic Scrolls offices. Tony used the office as a base for a while when he was doing consultancy gigs, and even contributed the odd idea here and there. However, this friction didn't exist at all between the UK's two most famed text adventure houses. Magnetic Scrolls and Level 9 were far more friendly as opposed to being competitive, seeing as they were both under the wing of the same software house and so forth. In fact, the same could be said of the relationship between Magnetic Scrolls and Infocom. There was never really any heated rivalry between the two big names, and whenever the studios did get together, they would be happy to discuss shop with each other rather than bristle in each other's general direction. Indeed, the relationship between Magnetic Scrolls and Infocom could have been even closer at one point, as we will soon detail. Simply put, Anita Sinclair and the rest of Magnetic Scrolls never really believed in treating folks like Infocom as rivals, often sneaking plenty of references to the studio in their games, and this feeling was reciprocated over the pond. Perhaps in this spirit of good cheer, there was a subconscious understanding that time, maybe, was not on the side of the text adventure, with those two little yet foreboding words, graphic adventure, becoming more and more prominent, 1987 being the year of games such as Maniac Mansion, Leisure Suit Larry, and various other titles in that field, and that it made a lot more sense for the big text adventure houses to stick together rather than fight each other. But in 1987, the storm wasn't quite here yet. 1987 is also the time that Anita Sinclair found a relationship with a man by the name of Michael Bywater, a writer whose first job with Magnetic Scrolls was to create the various trinkets in the box of the Guild of Thieves. Bywater was pretty skilled with the pen, and he was a close friend of Douglas Adams. Indeed, he'd worked closely with Adams on 1987's Bureaucracy, his rather epic and exceptionally challenging text adventure for Infocom. Sinclair and Bywater were in a relationship for a couple of years, although generally they kept the personal and business sides of things separate. Bywater was, after all, going to become a rather important part of the studio's next game, something that would eventually be called Jinxter, and a title that had a somewhat tortured path towards completion. Before we get into that, it's perhaps a good time to look at how the press tended to deal with Anita Sinclair, who was certainly getting a lot more coverage in the magazines as her studio grew in prominence. She was, without a shadow of a doubt, the public face of Magnetic Scrolls. It's quite amusing, really, to look back at the coverage of Magnetic Scrolls games or interviews with her, seeing as magazines can't ever not pay an inordinate amount of attention to the fact that, well, you know, she's a woman, and this manifests itself in some rather amusing and cringy ways. Now, I should say quickly that I don't particularly mean to excoriate these old mags for some of the things they printed. It's quite funny more than anything, and it just shows how much of a different time it was. Take, for example, this utter gem from the Games Machine, the beginning of what should, ostensibly, be a review of the game Fish. Anita Sinclair looks fab. I've always liked the lady, but now that she's put on a little weight since giving up smoking, she looks gorgeous. What a pity that on the day she took me to lunch, oh do get on with it, Ed, she could barely walk due to some very painful blisters on her feet. She was also suffering from having a jolly good time at the Telecomsoft dinner the night before where the wine was free. Apart from discussing the PC show, other magazines, adventures in general, and her Audi Quattro, we did eventually get around to Magnetic Scrolls' new game, Fish. I mean, that's an interesting start to a review, isn't it? It's like a B-Tech Vanity Fair infused with the smell of a rotten Scotch egg. I think it's even funnier if you replace Anita Sinclair with someone else from the industry like, I don't know, David Braben, or Bruce Everis. It's not exactly the sort of copy that would be written if they were the ones being interviewed, is it? This fedora-tastic paragraph is one of the more extreme examples, but the gaming press as a whole did have something of a tendency to approach Anita Sinclair like a bunch of hormonal schoolboys. She did, after all, have a certain glamour to her that most of the magazine's other subjects, lacked somewhat. There would be other silly things. One magazine created a year-end award for Most Attractive Programmer purely so that she could win it. Kind of a shame that this award hadn't existed previously, because I'm sure Jeff Minter could have picked up a couple of gons from it. No joke. Or utterly Partridgian lines from Sinclair users such as, "There is only one thing missing in your life. A fantastically beautiful and intelligent companion? I understand Anita Sinclair's already spoken for." when pushing a competition for a bloody Magnum light phaser, of all things. So what are Vernita's thoughts about all this attention? Well, it was the logical move, really, for Anita to be the face of the company. Male or female, she was the headstrong one, and the confident one. Confident enough too, at one point during a CES show where magnetic scrolls were demonstrating the pawn, tell representatives of the Dark Lord himself, Jack Trammell, that he was going to have to come to their stand if he wanted to have a demonstration of the game. And make no mistake, Jack came running. Generally, Anita would happily pay a little lip service to the more giddy questions that came her way before moving things to the matter at hand, and she would always be counted on for a good quote. So there were plenty more reasons why she was always in high demand rather than just the basic milk-based ones. It was a bit frustrating at times, mind you. While Anita being the face of the company was absolutely the best move for business, Magnetic Scrolls was at heart a very collaborative company, one where there wasn't really a de facto boss or a sole designer or a head programmer or anything like that, and Anita did feel that there was too much emphasis on her. Going back to her interview in Mark Hardesty's Classic Adventurer, Anita recalls an example when she absolutely insisted that a journo spend more time talking to Hugh Steers than her. He talked to him for nearly an hour and Anita for only 5 minutes. And guess what? When the final copy came out, Anita was all over it. It's Anita's parser, Anita's code and so on, while Hugh Steers, who had done a great deal more of this parser and this code that they were talking about, was literally not mentioned at all. It's kind of funny, really. It reminds me of Anita's close friend who's not her relation, and his own public image. How the impression of Uncle Sir Clive was of a sole person, tinkering in his shed and building the Spectrum or whatever entirely by hand, by himself, when that really wasn't the case at all. A difference being that Anita and the rest of Magnetic Scrolls perhaps got slightly more annoyed by it at times. Let's move on to the subject of Magnetic Scrolls' third game, 1987's Jinxter, one which had a rather fraught development. The game was originally known as Green Magic, and the story had been written by Anita's sister Georgina. Rob Steggles was away at university at the time. Unfortunately, the relationship between Georgina and the rest of the Magnetic team during development was pretty strained. There was a heavy clash in styles, the design veered dangerously off course, there was a firm deadline from Rainbird that the game had to be ready by Christmas, and tensions were rising to the point of there being a potential break between the two sisters. Eventually, Georgina delivered a final draft of the story and said that she wanted nothing else to do with it. But Anita still wasn't satisfied at all. For her, in her words, the whole thing was just too bloody twee. Enter Michael Bywater to save the day. Initially, Anita simply wanted Michael to polish the text up a bit, but in a few weeks he pretty much rewrote the whole thing, with only the game's logic and basic structure still present. Obviously Michael wasn't able to change that at this late stage, but he did change the way that it was enacted, putting his spin on every last bit of descriptive text. It was at this point that the name of the game was changed. Exit Green Magic and enter Jinxter, something of an inside reference pointing towards just how jinxed the project had felt through most of its development. Still, it was just about delivered on time. Jinxter is an odd one, it's fair to say. Most call it Magnetic Scrolls' riff on Infocom's Enchanter. The setting is something of an urban fantasy, where a man must save the land of Aquitania from evil witches, doing so by obtaining several jewels and using them to cast spells. The game harks back to the pawn by painting the protagonist as a pretty average person who gets pushed and pulled around by forces out of his control, and it also harks back to the pawn by treating said man very badly indeed. And you will most certainly bear the brunt of that as a player. There is quite a bit of fun to be had, it must be said. The design can be a bit slapdash, with those jewels actually not playing as much of an important part as they were perhaps supposed to, in lieu of more traditional text-adventure puzzles, but there's quite a lot of fun to be had when it comes to the game's writing. Michael Bywater adds a lot of acerbic wit and silly goings-on to the game, much more so than there was in the more straightforward Guild of Thieves, and there is certainly plenty of laughs to be had. With all that said though, yeah, this game is cruel. Naturally, there's some seriously nasty puzzles to be had, especially near the end of the game, the sort that will really test the adventurer's appetite for moon logic. But that is far from the coolest part of the game. That would be an unseen and barely explained meter that measures our hero's luck. Luck is a big part of the game. Hell, the whole thing starts with you almost getting flattened by a bus until a guardian miraculously saves you and deems you fit for the task in hand. But other than that, it's something you may barely notice. If you spend too much time dithering about, or you screw up to a point where a guardian has to point you in the direction of what to do next, you may be told that you feel a little bit less lucky than you used to, and that's it. So, what happens if you run out of luck? Well, you'll die. At some thoroughly arbitrary point, just about at the end of the game, with no way to get that luck back. Without even knowing it, you'll have been playing a game that was unwinnable for all this time, with no choice except to go back to the beginning. That is, well, bastardry on a grand scale. It's absolutely dreadful, a mechanic that's nothing but evil in its creation. Perhaps the most annoying thing is that it seems to go against everything that Magnetic Scrolls games stand for. I mean, you have this complex parser, right? You trumpet games based on the freedom of this parser, how you can mess around with it, stick all sorts of things in there and it'll actually understand what you're talking about. Well, here's a game that will kill you for doing exactly that and messing about away from the goal, and it won't even bloody tell you that it's doing it until you're right at the fucking ending. I mean, good lord. Insert more hefty swear words here if you want, because, I mean, I would, but I don't want to get this video banned. Even with all of this, Jinxter still received very good notices. People generally enjoyed it, and despite some of the exquisitely evil nastiness in its game design, it is still an adventure that you can have a good laugh with, particularly if you share Michael Bywater's rather barbed style of humour. He certainly deserves a hell of a lot of credit for saving the day, performing a similar role as he did for Douglas Adams' Bureaucracy when it came to finally getting that title over the line. As ever, Jinxter comes with some excellent art and a lovely package containing a magazine, a beer mat, a memo and other cool trinkets. For most people, I do imagine the cash that was spent on Jinxter was money well spent. But once again, that number was less than the number who'd splashed out on Guild of Thieves. This, unfortunately, would be a common trend as we get later into the decade, a steady downward slope that, even though Magnetic Scrolls never actually made a bad game, was something that wasn't exactly in their control. It'll continue to bite as we move towards their next two titles, the last big ones that would be made with the old Eltham engine. As we head into 1988, Rob Steggles makes his way back from university. He asks his old friends at Magnetic Scrolls for a reference, but they end up offering him a job instead. In the time that he's been away, Magnetic Scrolls has certainly become a larger company. Not huge or anything, but there's certainly more people trundling around the office than the old mates Ken, Hugh and Anita. Is it a successful company? Well, they've certainly had successors, to be sure, although it's fair to say that they weren't exactly raking in millions of pounds. Magnetic Scrolls, as a company, didn't ever make a huge profit as such, and as we've mentioned already, their games were only decreasing in sales. Text adventures are seen as on the way out, while point-and-click games are very much on the way in. Despite this, Magnetic Scrolls have no desire to switch over to the hot new format. They don't particularly care for the more graphical adventures at all. Hell, it actually took Anita Sinclair a fair bit of convincing from Tony Rainbird a couple of years previously that some pictures should be added to 16-bit versions of the porn, even if the game certainly ended up a lot better for it. Text adventures are what Magnetic Scrolls want to do, and it's something they still think can live. They have a very secret project in the works that they hope will revitalise, even revolutionise the age-old genre, even if in the eyes of most people the commercial time of the text adventure was very nearly coming to an end. Indeed, the next Magnetic Scrolls game is something that's almost in defiance of the ever-contracting text adventure market, eschewing the more popular settings and genres for something altogether more niche. What? No fantasy? No surrealism? No quirky British humour? Nope, none of these things. Corruption, Rob Steggall's latest title, is marketed as a grown-up adventure, one that's set right in the present-day heart of ultra-capitalist and Thatcherite central London, where you play as a high-flying young executive in a financial company who uncovers the rotting core of insider trading within those beige walls, and has to move fast in the space of a single day in order to stop himself from taking the fall for other people's misdeeds. With allusions to drug use, attempts at murder, and a promised emphasis on solving puzzles through conversation as opposed to doing it in the traditional text adventure way, Corruption is a wholly different kettle of fish to anything that Magnetic Scrolls has created before, even if it still has the ever-familiar Elton Parser and the nice artwork, this time provided by Alan Honeysett and Richard Selby. The game originally had the title of Assassin while in development. For a long time it was thought that its working title was Upon Westminster Bridge, but this appears to be another unfinished and quite mysterious project entirely that Anita Sinclair was largely working on solo. Corruption is certainly intriguing, and not your usual text adventure, but I do think it misses the mark a little. The premise itself is very nice, as is the promise of being able to have detailed conversations and for the action to take place in something closer to real time, but it doesn't quite work out fully in practice, and the game does become very trial and error. While conversations are a part of the game, they don't really come into play until right at the finish, and a lot of your success in conversation depends on you having already amassed the evidence required to clear your name, which you've done in traditional text adventure fashion. The puzzles to do so mostly aren't that bad, although the one to get out of the hospital is admittedly quite fiendish indeed, but the biggest trial and error part is figuring out the times that people come and go from their usual haunts so that you can do them. It's the sort of thing where, once you've roughly figured out the movements of the people in the office through various failed attempts, you're still going to have to do a fair bit of waiting around and doing nothing before you can get on with the task at hand. And entering wait several dozen times doesn't really help a lot with the story that the game's trying to weave. You can wait until a certain time if you wish, which is handy, although there's more of a risk of screwing up by doing that. I don't mind the game at all, I think it's full of promise, and I'd have absolutely loved to see more text adventure games in this modern thriller vein, but it just needs to be that little bit tighter to really shine. As usual, Corruption comes with all the goodies that you would expect out of a Magnetic Scrolls package. You get a tape that features both John Malloy's excellent title tune and a recorded conversation that contains some useful info. There's that, ripped pages from a personal organiser, a casino chip, and the usual nicely done guides and so on. A lovely package. It's another pretty well received title, but again it's another one that suffers from increasingly diminishing commercial sales. Perhaps not a surprise, as something like this game is always going to be quite niche, but that combined with the state of text adventures meant that it was just never going to be much of a seller. It's also Rob Steggall's last game for Magnetic Scrolls. A year or so after this title, he would have a blazing row with Ken and Anita over wages, which would end with him walking out. By that time, the stress of the market's contraction was starting to hang over everybody, but we'll get to that. Before we move on to Magnetic Scrolls' next adventure, there's a few odd little tidbits when it comes to titles that didn't see the light of day. Specifically, a project that could have seen two of the biggest names remaining in text adventures getting together. For many, one of the most intriguing things about Magnetic Scrolls is their small role in possibly developing the long-awaited and much-hyped sequel to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game, Milliways, the restaurant at the end of the universe. This had been in the works, somewhat, since 1985. Douglas Adams had initially been quite enthusiastic about it, but then seemed to quickly lose interest, setting about the creation of Bureaucracy instead, until he then kind of lost interest in that too in favour of his books, and gave it over to Michael Bywater. Bywater was moved to the US by Infocom in 1987 to specifically work on Milliways, but the arrangement proved unsatisfactory, and he was soon back in England, while Infocom's Amy Briggs was assigned to head the project. Then, in February of 1988, after she left, the ever more chaotic Infocom management announced that they were going to give the project over to Magnetic Scrolls with Michael Bywater designing, a move that infuriated the rest of the company, angered by a loss of creative control that hadn't happened previously in the history of Infocom. There was a fair bit of behind the scenes wrangling with Infocom getting it back, but it ultimately all became irrelevant when Infocom closed in 1989 after Activision shut down the office, sealing the door on a possible Hitchhiker's sequel for good. Times are starting to get a great deal harder for Magnetic Scrolls, that's for sure. But sometimes, when things are taking a turn for the worse, a studio can suddenly produce something really high quality indeed. And that's exactly what Magnetic Scrolls did. Their next game, Fish, from late 1988, is seen by a lot of text adventure and studio fans as the best thing the company ever did. A magnificent story that contains everything good about Magnetic Scrolls games, while leaving out most of the bad. The idea for this game came about thanks to a conversation between John Malloy, Magnetic's music man, and two friends of his, Phil South and Pete Kemp. Apparently, they were on a bus, spouting off weird ideas for games at each other, and one of them said, "What if you started the game as a goldfish and you have to save the world?" Somehow, this idea stuck, and it would become the basis for the game. The management loved the idea, and suddenly this trio had their foot in the door, writing and programming this weird little game. Now, if you think that some of Magnetic's other adventures have ventured far into the surreal, then Fish takes everything to another level. It's a game of interdimensional espionage where you do indeed play as a goldfish who has to save the world from a group of anarchists called the Seven Deadly Fins. You do this by travelling through warps in your goldfish bowl and taking over the body of someone else, usually a human, meaning that this adventure is going to take you absolutely all over the place. The writing throughout is absolutely top drawer, the best in any Magnetic Scrolls game for my money, not just when it comes to picturing the scenes, but also thanks to the tremendous wit. It's full of memorable one-liners and settings, and even the aquatic-based puns, which, let's face it, the game could have consisted almost entirely of, always seem to stick the landing. The puzzles aren't all that bad either. There's hard stuff for sure, but there's nothing here that you wouldn't expect to find in a text adventure, really. When you add the usual presentation to all of this, the lovely pictures, the various cool trinkets, yeah, I would agree with most of the folk who say that Fish is Magnetic Scrolls' best work. If you're interested in playing their games, I think that this is the one you should start on, even more so than the much more famous Pawn. It's one of the best text adventures ever made, and it really should have been a success. But sadly, it wasn't at all. And this time, it was for more reasons than the continuing contraction of the text adventure market. Just as Fish came out around Christmas of 1988, something happened that would change everything, and not for the better. This is, after all, right around the time that BT told Telecomsoft that they were going to be sold off, and naturally that includes all the labels. Commercially, Fish never stood a chance. Thanks to all of this chaos, the game came out with virtually no promotion at all, and it didn't sell too well, even compared to other text adventures of the time. A huge shame indeed for such a great title. By this time, the relationship between Magnetic Scrolls and Rainbird was very much at the breaking point. They didn't get on all that well after Tony left, and the diminishing sales were only making things worse there. One presumes that Rainbird tried to cajole Magnetic Scrolls into creating more commercially friendly titles, and that the response from Anita Sinclair and company was quite the resounding no. With the sale of Telecomsoft looming, Magnetic Scrolls knew that the writing was on the wall. They were quite certain that whoever picked up the company wouldn't wish to continue publishing their adventures, and their instincts were proved right when Microprose became the new owners. They had interest in some of the groups that had agreements with Telecomsoft, particularly the likes of Argonaut and Realtime, but as far as the group from London that make bloody ancient text adventures goes, yeah, that's not happening. Magnetic Scrolls no longer have a publisher. More than that, they'll enter into a rather brutal legal battle over the next year or so with Microprose in order to get the rights to their old games back. They still have a project that they hope is a big ace up their sleeve, but that obviously continues to demand that money be fed into it at all times. Anita Sinclair described 1989 as the year of horrendous collapse, and this could be applied to the world of text adventures as a whole. 1989 is the year that the almighty Infocom closes its doors for good. It's also the year that Level 9 announced that they're going to leave text adventures behind, releasing their final one, Scapegoat, in the winter. A couple of years later, they too will close. Mosaic Publishing, Vicky Khan's outfit, had closed the previous year following a rather intriguing text-based licensed game for the satirical BBC comedy Yes Prime Minister. If you asked most people about text adventures in 1989, they'd probably tell you that the genre, commercially at least, was dead. On the personal side of things, it's also the time when Anita Sinclair and Michael Bywater broke up, meaning that he now leaves this particular picture. However, magnetic scrolls were nothing if not defiant, even if they were now the last ones standing. One thing that did help in this period was a wealthy background. Anita Sinclair in particular did have a fair bit of personal and familial finance to call on, and they probably wouldn't have survived 1989 without it. Another thing that helped was a new venture, one that saw Anita partner up with Tony Rainbird, that big old and rather familiar name called Special Reserve, the ones who would be masters of the mail order business in the first half of the 1990s. Tony Rainbird was a huge fan of adventures and was one of the few people who still believed somewhat in the genre. Therefore, one part of the Special Reserve empire was a sister mail order company called Official Secrets, one that was entirely centred around adventure games and also a company through which people could purchase official solution books for Magnetic Scrolls games, get the monthly Confidential magazine, amongst others. Even more than that, however, membership to the club also granted you an exclusive game created by the masters themselves, a little title that went by the name of Myth. Myth is, of course, the smallest of the Magnetic Adventures. Created solely by a young man named Paul Findlay, with Jeff Quilley returning to provide a few more nice picks, the game is set in ancient Greece, and as Lee and Lay says, it recounts the struggles of the Olympian deities as they battle to maintain their religious monopoly in the face of the gathering storm of Christianity. One could almost see text adventures as the Greek deities, and point and clicks as Christianity. It's all quite simple, really, with a few nice pictures. To be honest, most of the short game will be spent either playing cards with Chow on the Ferryman, or figuring out how to get a bunch of keys across the river Styx. Not a particularly consequential game, but not a terrible one. And hey, it came free with the membership. Unfortunately, Official Secrets wasn't enough to change the fortune of the text adventure. Membership was never quite enough for it to be profitable, and after 2 game yet unfertile years, Official Secrets was closed up. I've repeatedly mentioned that Magnetic Scrolls still felt like they had one more ace up their sleeve, a project that had been worked on since 1987. Despite all the awful setbacks of 1989, the end of the year did see them find a publisher who would bring their new vision for the text adventure to the market. With one more hail of publicity, a deal was announced between Magnetic Scrolls and Virgin. Yep, it's Anita Sinclair and Richard Branson. So what exactly is this big project? It's something that will replace the old Elton Parser, a new concept called Magnetic Windows. The name is somewhat similar to Microsoft Windows, yes, but this was a time when Windows was still not exactly welcomed by all, and hardly the world beater that it would become. Magnetic Windows will allow even more freedom for the text adventure. You have an interface that's much like a GUI, where there's one window for the story itself, another for the picture, another for a map, another for a compass, and so on. Doing this could allow for the inclusion of some proper cutscenes, which their next game would indeed have, and the user would be able to click on those images for further information, which they couldn't do before. And of course, the player would be able to manipulate these windows in whatever layout they saw fit. It's a bold move indeed, something that Anita and the rest of Magnetic Scrolls greatly believed in. The final gambit, the final defiant move against the dying of the light. The concept and story for the first Magnetic Windows game, Wonderland, came from a man named David Bishop. As you might have guessed, the game is based on the adventures of Alice in Wonderland, promising you the chance to step into Lewis Carroll's spellbinding imagination. Alice is always a good base for an adventure, of course, even if this isn't exactly transmogrifying goldfish like the last game. Still, the new interface for the adventure was perhaps more important than the adventure itself. The idea for a windowed text adventure was kicking around inside of Anita Sinclair's head since 1987, and she may have possibly used one of her own personal projects, the unreleased Upon Westminster Bridge, as a testbed for the concept. Thanks to this interface, as well as various other games and the aforementioned issues the company faced, Wonderland would spend 3 years in development, although this lengthy development didn't necessarily hurt the game that much, with the end adventure itself actually being one of the company's cleanest and most efficient. The interface, though, was everything. From about 1989 onwards, all hands were on deck to sort this out, and on reflection it's pretty impressive. They were trying to recreate Microsoft Windows on a budget of damn near nothing. They looked beyond this first title too. They hoped that if Wonderland and Magnetic Windows was a success, that it would revolutionise the adventure industry. It would be a shot of adrenaline right in the heart of the text adventure. Everyone would want to come to Magnetic Scrolls to use their system, and they'd be very happy to license it out. That was the dream, of course. Alas, when Wonderland finally arrived on the shelves in late 1990, none of that happened. Wonderland, and the ambition of Magnetic Windows as an interface, certainly warrants some credit. It's a bold move. One can really appreciate just how defiant Magnetic Scrolls were as a company, and it comes through here. The adventure game itself is also absolutely fine. The generally good things about all Magnetic games, from the writing to the artwork, which now includes several quite lengthy cutscenes, has certainly not diminished in the new interface. But it was pretty far from perfect. The trouble with Wonderland was that it absolutely guzzled memory. If you had too many windows open, it wouldn't be long before the game started to run like a total pig, and you'd be kindly asked to kill a bunch of the windows so that the game could actually start whirring again. If you were playing the game on an Amiga 500, you would probably get that a hell of a lot. It's one of those cruel twists of fate, isn't it? Microsoft themselves had a great deal of trouble establishing Windows and convincing people that a GUI was better than a simple and fast command line. It wouldn't even start to stick until the release of 3.0, again in 1990. And Magnetic Scrolls had the exact same trouble with Magnetic Windows. For the seasoned text adventure player, the new interface may have looked nice, but most people preferred the efficiency of simply typing into a parser, something that wasn't going to be quite as taxing on a computer's memory. For those who may not be so familiar with the genre, well, again, it looked nice, but for all the nice sheen on this interface, once you peel it all away, it is still a text adventure. That and we're now in the 1990s. What's happening in the world of those point and clicks that the studio hates so much? Well, The Secret of Monkey Island was released a month or so before Wonderland, and that's probably all you need to know. The point and click is about to enter the golden age, and the text adventure, well, again, for most people, it's dead, and nothing's going to change that. Wonderland was the all-in project for Magnetic Scrolls. They put absolutely everything into it, and sadly the game flopped. With this flop came something of a grim acceptance of inevitability. They did manage to settle their lawsuit with Microprose and get the rights to their old games, and through doing this they were able to re-release a couple of them in 1991, the first and only Magnetic Scrolls collection featuring Guild of Thieves, Corruption and Fish, now playable in the new Magnetic Windows environment. Again, this didn't sell, and Virgin dropped Magnetic Scrolls shortly after. Their very final game that wasn't a text adventure, perversely, actually saw them work under Microprose. It's a rather obscure RPG called The Legacy Realm of Terror that only came out for PC-DOS in 1993, and to be honest it wasn't something that would have impressed fans of the genre at that time. Indeed, it doesn't appear as though the company's heart was ever into it at all. They folded halfway through the game's development, leaving Microprose to put other people on the project to finish it. Finally, Magnetic Scrolls recognised, with a heavy heart, that their time was up. It should be noted that unlike a bunch of companies that we've covered previously, they didn't go fully bankrupt, and that they wound up their business in a professional manner with no debts to speak of. They just, at last, knew that they were finished. With their closure in 1992, the last big name in text adventures left the scene, and, at least from a commercial perspective, the genre finally reached midnight. It's worth spending a little bit of time here, at the end, to talk a bit about what happened next, and the various fates of these people. Because after all, there's a lot of people out there who still love text adventures, for whom the genre has never died in their heart. Indeed, while magazines might have said that text adventures were dead, there were always lights in the darkness. smaller companies like Zenobi, who sold adventures to people through mail order during the last days of the 8-bit micros and beyond. There's some pretty good things to highlight here too when it comes to the people who've kept the games of Magnetic Scrolls alive, just as others have done for the likes of Infocom. Since 1997, a man named Stefan Meyer has maintained a website by the name of the Magnetic Scrolls Memorial, and if you want to know anything about the history of the company, this is undoubtedly the place to go to. You've got full details on all of the games, recollections from people like Rob Steggles, interviews from the past, and all sorts of other magazine scans. Basically, if it's anything that's related to Magnetic Scrolls, chances are good that it's probably here. However, more than that, Meyer's website also includes a way to experience the games for yourself in your web browser, something called Magnetic Scripts. You can click on the info for any game, and you can also play it too, something designed to preserve the games and prevent them from being lost. As far as I can tell, Magnetic Scripts has been on the website for most of its existence, with the knowledge and blessing of both Ken Gordon and Anita Sinclair. Over the years, other fans have also built Magnetic Scrolls interpreter programs. There's Nicholas Carlson's Magnetic and Thomas Detbarn's Demagnetic, for example. They've certainly made sure of a few ways to play these games that aren't just loading up an emulator. Moreover, Meyer and Hugh Steers formed Strand Games in 2016. Strand doesn't just look to preserve the old games, but to remaster them, and once again it has the blessing, as well as participation, of a lot of the old Magnetic Scrolls folk. The Pawn, Guild of Thieves and Jinxter are available in a new remastered form for a couple of quid a piece, and can also be played quite efficiently on mobile phones if you wish. As far as preservation goes, Strand were finally able to recover the source code for the original Magnetic Scrolls games, accessing the solitary existing 30-year-old tape backup of the code with the help of a quick spot of bacon in the oven. Aside from all this excellent work, where are the denizens of Magnetic Scrolls today? A lot of them are still ploughing their trade around computers of various sorts. Ken Gordon, for example, works at Microsoft, while Rob Steggles is in telecommunications. Jeff Quilley, the man behind most of those wonderful pictures, is now a professor of arts at the University of Sussex, while Michael Bywater has quite a prolific career as a journalist, columnist and author under his belt. John Malloy, the music composer and a big part of The Almighty Fish, sadly passed away of cancer in 2018. And what of the most visible of them all? As far as games go, Anita Sinclair has been somewhat quiet since the Magnetic Scrolls days, with not much of a footprint to be found on the internet. She has surfaced a couple of times to recount the old days, but not often. Before her excellent 2018 interview with Mark Hardesty for The Classic Adventurer, she hadn't been seen in the press for many years, perhaps not since a 2001 article in PC Zone. She seems to have other passions nowadays, particularly when it comes to cards. A love of poker was always something that she shared with her good friend Sir Clive over the years, but her biggest strength is bridge. A profile on the English Bridge Union website reveals that she's won plenty of trophies in the game over the years, and there's a few instances of Anita talking about her love of the game. And so, the book closes on Magnetic Scrolls. It's quite the story indeed, bigger perhaps than even I realised, and one that spans from the heyday of the text adventure right up to the bitter end, at least from a commercial perspective. Even as someone who went into this without too much knowledge about text adventures, admittedly, learning about what makes a good text game tick, as well as this company, has been quite the joy. And I absolutely admire Magnetic for their defiance, even when all appeared to be rather hopeless. They are a truly great company. Not exactly the most prolific, with only a few games over their existence, but none of those games are what you'd call bad or boring. They're all trying to do something quite novel in their own way. It's been a pretty fun ride to track their tale, and hopefully people will continue, even if it may be a drip, to discover the work that they did. Next time in the Telecom Soft universe, we'll be looking at something a bit flashier. It's the turn of Argonaut, with a bit of real-time games to go along with it. So yeah, the companies certainly keep getting bigger. But until then, it's time to say, as ever, bye for now.